Hello, dear listener. Before we begin, I invite you to set your volume just right. Not too loud, not too soft, just gentle enough to keep you company. Now close your eyes, lie still, and let the outside world fade away. We are about to drift into rest together. Tonight, we begin the very first story in our series of boring history for sleep. A calm journey through time, told slowly, with no rush. This episode is titled, The Evolution of Shipbuilding in the Mediterranean. If you enjoy these quiet histories, remember to like this video and subscribe, so each night we can meet again, gently, in the same calm space. Now, let us begin. In the quiet of history, long before the engines of modern ships ever roared across the seas, the Mediterranean was already a stage of constant movement. Its waters were calm at times, yet restless in storms, and across these waters, countless generations of sailors, merchants, and explorers attempted to leave their mark. To understand the slow unfolding story of shipbuilding in this region, we must drift back to the earliest days, when the first inhabitants of Mediterranean shores looked out upon the horizon and wondered how to cross it. These early people did not begin with large wooden ships, but with the simplest of rafts, crafted from reeds bound together, or hollowed-out logs that floated gently near the coast. In these fragile vessels, they discovered a new world of possibility. The sea was not only a barrier, but also a pathway. It offered food, connection, and the promise of lands beyond the visible shoreline. Over time, the communities who lived near rivers and coasts began to refine their skills. They observed how certain woods floated better than others, how the binding of planks could hold longer, and how shaping a hull could allow the vessel to cut through the water with less resistance. These experiments, passed down through generations, gradually shaped the art of shipbuilding into something more deliberate and enduring. In the ancient world, the Egyptians were among the first to turn shipbuilding into an organized craft. Along the Nile, they learned to use papyrus reeds to make light boats suitable for river travel. But when they looked outward to the Mediterranean, they needed sturdier forms. They began building wooden ships with planks fastened together, able to withstand longer journeys. Some of these vessels were designed for trade, carrying goods like grain, papyrus, and gold, while others carried warriors and soldiers, extending the reach of Egyptian influence. Slowly, the sea became not only a mirror of daily survival, but a stage for power. As centuries passed, the Phoenicians emerged as true masters of Mediterranean seafaring. Living along the coasts of present-day Lebanon, they had limited land for farming, so they turned their energy to the sea. They built strong, reliable ships that could travel far, carrying purple dye, glass, and timber to distant markets. They founded colonies along the Mediterranean, from North Africa to Spain, leaving behind a legacy of trade and communication that tied the region together. The ship was at the center of their society, and their shipwrights improved techniques with each generation, learning to balance speed with cargo capacity and strength with maneuverability. The Mediterranean at this time was not simply water separating cultures, but a bridge that carried ideas, goods, and languages across its waves. The Greeks, inspired by the Phoenicians, advanced shipbuilding further. They crafted long, narrow vessels known as galleys, which relied not only on sails, but also on rows of oarsmen. These ships could move swiftly, darting through the sea with precision. For the Greeks, ships were not only tools of trade, but also instruments of war. Naval battles determined the rise and fall of city-states, and the trireme, a galley with 3 rows of oars, became a symbol of Athenian power. The sea was no longer just a place for exploration, but a battlefield where empires were decided. Shipbuilding evolved accordingly as builders learned to strengthen hulls, increase speed, and design ships capable of ramming enemies or carrying troops across waters. All the while, the Mediterranean remained both generous and demanding. The calm stretches of its water encouraged trade, but sudden storms reminded sailors of its danger. The art of shipbuilding, then, was a response to both opportunity and risk. Each improvement in design, each adjustment in materials, was a way of negotiating with the sea itself, acknowledging its power while daring to master it. With every generation, Mediterranean shipbuilders carried forward knowledge, from simple reed boats to complex wooden galleys, and the region became not only a crossroads of cultures, but also a workshop of maritime innovation. Even in these earliest stages, one can see the quiet rhythm of history. unfolding like the steady sound of waves against a hull, unhurried yet unending. The sea waited patiently, and humanity responded slowly, carefully, crafting vessels that would one day carry civilizations farther than they could ever imagine. As the story of shipbuilding in the Mediterranean moved forward, the sea became a canvas upon which different civilizations painted their ambitions. After the Greeks, it was the Romans who truly transformed the Mediterranean into what they proudly called Mare Nostrum, or our sea. To them, control of the waters meant control of trade, control of communication, and ultimately control of empire. Roman shipbuilders inherited knowledge from both the Greeks and the Phoenicians, but they adapted it to their own needs, creating vessels that were not only efficient for war, but also capable of carrying heavy loads of grain, oil, wine, and building materials to sustain their vast territories. The Roman navy relied heavily on galleys, ships powered by oars and sails, but the Romans also developed larger cargo ships, known as navis honoraria. These merchant vessels could carry thousands of amphorae, filled with goods from one corner of the empire to another. In these ships, we see a remarkable shift. The sea was not simply a place of confrontation, but a vital artery of supply, linking faraway provinces with the heart of Rome. Grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, marble from Greece, and countless other products filled Roman harbors, making shipbuilding one of the cornerstones of imperial survival. To construct these ships, Roman builders used sturdy oak and pine, carefully selecting timber to endure long journeys. They perfected techniques of joinery, using mortise and tenon joints to fasten planks tightly, creating hulls that were strong and durable. They also applied pitch and tar to waterproof the wood, giving ships resilience against the endless beating of waves. In battle, Roman ingenuity was equally visible. When confronted by Carthage in the Punic Wars, the Romans were initially inexperienced at sea, yet they quickly learned and introduced the corvus, a boarding device that allowed their soldiers to storm enemy ships, turning naval battles into contests fought like land wars. This adaptation shows how shipbuilding was never isolated from the broader needs of society. It was always tied to trade, to defense, and to the ambitions of rulers. Over centuries, the Mediterranean became busy with movement. Merchant fleets sailed in steady rhythm, fishermen cast their nets close to shore, and war galleys patrolled like guardians of empire. Ports grew larger, shipyards rang with the sound of hammers, and knowledge of construction passed from father to son, generation after generation. Each plank nailed, each sail hoisted, was part of a tradition that stretched back to the earliest reed boats. Yet with every century, the designs became more refined, more capable of enduring long voyages. The Byzantine Empire carried forward much of Roman shipbuilding knowledge, adapting it to new challenges. With Constantinople as a hub of trade and defense, the Byzantines developed the famous dromon, a swift warship equipped with oars and sails. These ships carried the terrifying weapon known as Greek fire, a liquid substance that could burn even upon water. To face Arab fleets and to guard their capital, Byzantine shipwrights focused on speed, maneuverability, and strength, proving once again that the sea demanded constant innovation. In this period, the Mediterranean was no longer dominated by a single power, but shared by many, and so shipbuilding became a competitive art. Arab sailors introduced their own designs, bringing knowledge from the Indian Ocean, including the triangular lateen sail that allowed ships to tack against the wind. This simple yet powerful innovation would spread widely, changing not only Mediterranean sailing, but eventually influencing European navigation far beyond. As centuries rolled on, each culture left its imprint. The Venetians and Genoese in the later medieval period turned their cities into maritime republics, where shipyards known as arsenali worked like vast factories, producing fleets to support trade and protect interests. The Mediterranean evolved into a sea of constant movement, where trade, religion, war, and culture all flowed upon the decks of ships. Yet through all of this, the essence of shipbuilding remained the same. It was the quiet but vital art of crafting vessels that allowed humanity to defy distance, to face storms, and to reach across waters that might otherwise divide. The Mediterranean whispered its demands, and shipwrights answered patiently with wood, tar, rope, and sail. And so the story of shipbuilding continued, each new vessel a bridge between lands, a silent witness to the slow rhythm of history, carrying dreams, ambitions, and survival across the endless horizon. As the medieval centuries unfolded, the Mediterranean became not only a place of exchange, but also a silent stage for rivalry between rising maritime powers. Among them, Venice and Genoa stood out, their fortunes tied entirely to the sea. In these bustling republics, shipbuilding reached new heights of organization, scale, and innovation. The Venetian arsenal, for instance, was more than a shipyard. It was an early model of industrial production, capable of building and outfitting ships with astonishing speed. At its peak, the arsenal could assemble a galley in a single day, thanks to the careful division of labor, the stockpiling of prefabricated parts, and the tireless efforts of skilled craftsmen who worked as if in rhythm with one another. This efficiency allowed Venice to maintain both a formidable navy and a vast merchant fleet, ensuring control over vital trade routes that stretched from the Levant to the coasts of Western Europe. The galleys of Venice, long and narrow with sharp prows, were ideal for swift movement and naval combat, while their rounder merchant vessels, known as cogs, carried silks, spices, and other precious cargo from east to west. Genoa, not to be outdone, also developed thriving shipyards and fleets that competed fiercely with Venice. Their rivalry led to numerous conflicts at sea, where ships clashed not only for territory, but also for dominance of lucrative trade. Yet beyond their wars, these maritime republics advanced shipbuilding in quieter ways, refining hull designs, experimenting with rigging systems, and balancing the demands of cargo space with the need for speed. It was in this era that the lateen sail became widespread across Mediterranean vessels, giving ships the ability to sail more effectively against the wind and thus expand their reach beyond the predictable patterns of seasonal breezes. This triangular sail, inherited from Arab seafaring traditions, slowly blended with square sails to create versatile rigs that would eventually power the great age of exploration. Meanwhile, in the eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantines and later the Ottomans continued to rely on their own naval traditions. The Ottomans, in particular, constructed massive fleets to project power across the sea, their shipyards along the Golden Horn producing galleys that were used in famous battles, such as Lepanto in 1571. In that clash, hundreds of ships from Christian and Ottoman forces fought in one of the largest naval battles of the early modern era, a reminder that shipbuilding was not only about trade and travel, but also about survival and empire. Each ship carried not just wood and sail, but the ambitions of rulers and the fate of nations. Beyond war, however, everyday life in the Mediterranean still depended on countless smaller vessels. Fishermen in villages carved out boats suited for shallow waters. Coastal traders built sturdy but modest ships to carry salt, grain, or textiles between nearby ports. For them, shipbuilding was not a grand industrial affair, but a family tradition, where knowledge of wood, tools, and knots was passed down like an inheritance. These smaller boats remind us that the evolution of shipbuilding was not only driven by empires and battles, but also by the quiet persistence of ordinary people whose lives were tied to the rhythm of the sea. By the late medieval period, the Mediterranean had become a laboratory of maritime technology. From the smallest fishing boats to the grandest galleys, ships reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge. They embodied the careful choices of builders who knew which woods to use, how to bend planks with heat and moisture, and how to balance weight and stability. Every vessel was an answer to a problem posed by the sea: how to carry more without sinking, how to move faster without breaking, how to endure storms without tearing apart. This slow evolution, born of trial, error, and experience, carried Mediterranean shipbuilding closer to a transformation that would eventually connect it with the wider oceans of the world. For now, however, the sea remained both familiar and vast, a contained world of exchange and rivalry, where Venice, Genoa, Byzantium, and the Ottomans each left their marks. In the hum of shipyards, in the creak of ropes and masts, in the splash of oars on water, the Mediterranean whispered the same lesson it always had: that those who mastered shipbuilding mastered connection, wealth, and power. The ships that glided across its surface were more than wood and canvas. They were lifelines of history, carrying civilizations steadily, patiently toward the future. As the story of shipbuilding entered the early modern period, the Mediterranean stood at a turning point. For centuries, it had been the center of maritime innovation, the heart of trade, and the stage of great naval rivalries. Yet slowly the horizon widened beyond its familiar waters, as new voyages of discovery began to draw attention toward the Atlantic and the oceans beyond. Still, the Mediterranean retained its importance, and the traditions of shipbuilding within it adapted to meet both new and old demands. In cities like Venice and Genoa, shipyards continued their steady work, producing fleets for commerce and war. But now, alongside galleys and cogs, new hybrid vessels appeared, incorporating square sails with lateen sails to form what became known as carracks and caravels. These ships, though often associated with Atlantic explorers, had their roots in Mediterranean experiments. The lateen sail, perfected in these waters, was crucial for tacking against the wind, while the robust hulls learned from centuries of galley construction offered durability. In this way, the Mediterranean remained a silent contributor to the age of exploration, even as Portuguese and Spanish ships began to cross oceans. For Mediterranean powers, however, the sea close to home remained the focus. The Ottoman Empire expanded its influence across North Africa, Greece, and the Levant, relying on enormous fleets of galleys to secure control. Their shipyards in Constantinople and elsewhere bustled with activity, producing vessels that carried soldiers, supplies, and officials across the empire. The Venetians, though increasingly challenged, maintained their traditions, defending trade routes and supplying markets with Eastern goods. The Mediterranean had become a patchwork of contested waters, with pirates, corsairs, and privateers adding yet another layer of danger. To counter them, shipbuilders began strengthening hulls, designing ships that could endure long patrols and sudden battles. In coastal towns, the humbler work of shipbuilding continued as always. Fishermen still required their modest boats, and traders still depended on small but reliable vessels to carry goods to nearby markets. In this way, shipbuilding was not only the domain of empires, but also of villages and families. The techniques varied according to region. Some preferred pine, others oak. Some shaped boats with flat bottoms for shallow harbors, others with deeper hulls for the open sea. Each vessel reflected a careful calculation, a response to local conditions, winds, and tides. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Mediterranean was also influenced by the broader changes of naval warfare. Cannon fire began to dominate battles, and ships were now expected to carry not only men and provisions, but also heavy artillery. This required thicker hulls, stronger decks, and new methods of bracing. Galleys, once supreme, began to lose ground to sailing ships that could carry more guns and maneuver without reliance on oarsmen. The Great Battle of Lepanto had shown the power of galleys in numbers, but over time the balance shifted, and the Mediterranean gradually saw more full-rigged sailing ships joining its waters. Yet even as technology changed, the rhythm of life at sea remained constant. In quiet harbors, sails flapped in the breeze, ropes creaked against wooden masts, and the smell of tar and pitch lingered in the air. Shipwrights bent over their work, smoothing planks, hammering nails, and tying knots that held not only ships together, but also the continuity of tradition. They were rarely remembered by name, yet their craft sustained entire societies. Every amphora of wine shipped across the sea, every barrel of grain, every marble column carried from quarry to city depended on their skill. The Mediterranean itself, timeless and patient, bore witness to these changes. Its waters had seen the first reed rafts, the proud triremes of Athens, the mighty cargo ships of Rome, and now the hybrid vessels of a new age. Each wave that lapped against the shore carried echoes of centuries of effort, each ripple a reminder that shipbuilding was more than wood and rope. It was an unbroken dialogue between humanity and the sea, a conversation that stretched across generations. By the close of the early modern period, Mediterranean shipbuilding had woven itself into a global story. Its designs and traditions influenced ships that sailed far beyond its coasts, even as its own waters remained alive with trade, war, and daily life. The evolution was slow, steady, and deliberate, a reflection of the sea itself, never hurried, always enduring. And so the Mediterranean continued to cradle its ships, watching quietly as human ambition, fear, and hope were carried upon its surface, always forward, always into the unfolding chapters of history. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Mediterranean world found itself in the shadow of broader global change. The Atlantic powers, Spain, Portugal, England, and later France, were sending fleets across oceans, exploring, colonizing, and trading on a scale the Mediterranean had never seen before. Yet the waters between Europe, Africa, and Asia remained crucial, and shipbuilding in this enclosed sea continued to adapt, not only in response to local needs, but also to the influence of these wider currents of innovation. In this era, the galley, once the iconic vessel of the Mediterranean, slowly faded from dominance. The reliance on oarsmen, often slaves or convicts, became less practical compared to the power and endurance of sailing ships. The Mediterranean shipyards, especially in Venice, Marseille, and the Ottoman ports, shifted their focus toward building larger sailing vessels, capable of carrying more cargo, mounting more guns, and enduring longer journeys. These ships were influenced by Northern European models, yet they bore the marks of Mediterranean tradition, with sleek lines and lateen sails still present in hybrid forms. The lateen sail remained a feature on smaller vessels, fishing boats, and coastal traders because it allowed easy maneuvering in variable winds and tight harbors. Thus, the Mediterranean retained a dual identity. On one hand, adopting the full-rigged ships of the broader European world, on the other, preserving older designs suited to its unique conditions. The 18th century saw bustling activity in shipyards across the region. In Venice, although the city's political power waned, the arsenal continued as a center of craftsmanship, producing both merchant ships and warships with remarkable efficiency. The French established powerful naval bases at Toulon and other Mediterranean ports, seeking to project strength in both the Mediterranean and beyond. The Ottomans, facing challenges from European fleets, invested heavily in their own naval construction, building galleons and later ships of the line to maintain control of their maritime empire. Yet even with these powerful vessels, the Mediterranean remained a place of diversity in shipbuilding. Alongside the imposing ships of the line, there were countless smaller craft, feluccas, tartanes, xebecs, and polaccas, each with distinct designs. The xebec, for example, was a fast and agile vessel, with a narrow hull and large lateen sails, favored by both traders and pirates for its speed. The polacca, with its combination of square and lateen sails, became a common sight in the 18th century, used for both commerce and war. Each of these ships reflected centuries of adaptation, shaped by the winds, waters, and needs of the Mediterranean basin. Pirates and corsairs remained a constant presence, especially in the waters of North Africa, where the so-called Barbary corsairs launched raids on European shipping. This danger spurred European powers to maintain strong fleets in the Mediterranean and pushed shipbuilders to design vessels that could not only carry goods, but also defend themselves against sudden attack. Merchant ships were often armed, blending the roles of commerce and defense in their very structure. Shipbuilding knowledge during this time became increasingly scientific. Mathematical treatises on hull design, buoyancy, and sail dynamics circulated among shipwrights. Naval academies trained officers not only in navigation and seamanship, but also in the principles of ship construction. Yet despite the advance of science, much of shipbuilding remained an art, guided by experience, instinct, and tradition passed down in shipyards, where families worked together for generations. Every curve of a hull, every angle of a mast, was the result of choices tested by time. By the late 18th century, the Mediterranean was a sea of contrasts. Great ships of the line carrying dozens of cannon floated side by side with graceful feluccas skimming along the coast. In busy ports, the smell of pitch and sawdust filled the air, and the sound of hammers echoed as shipwrights bent planks into shape. The sea remained alive with movement. Grain from Egypt, salt from Sicily, textiles from the Levant, wine from Provence, and spices from distant lands all passed through Mediterranean waters, carried by ships whose very existence was the product of centuries of learning. The Mediterranean had lost its monopoly on maritime innovation, but it retained its role as a vital artery of connection, and its shipbuilding traditions endured, blending old with new, local with global. The story of shipbuilding here was no longer just about local dominance, but about how an ancient sea continued to support and shape the lives of millions, quietly, steadily. Through vessels that carried more than cargo, they carried the rhythm of history itself. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Mediterranean once again stood at a crossroads. Centuries of tradition still lingered in its shipyards, where craftsmen bent wood and stitched sails much as their ancestors had done. Yet the world was changing, and with it came new demands, new materials, and new ways of thinking about ships. The age of sail still dominated the waters, but on the horizon, a different kind of power was beginning to appear. Steam engines, first tested on rivers and later adapted to ocean travel, slowly made their way into Mediterranean harbors. At first, these strange new vessels with their paddle wheels and iron fittings seemed out of place among the elegant lines of lateen-rigged boats and square-rigged frigates. Many doubted they could endure the unpredictable swells of the open sea. But little by little, steam proved its worth, and shipbuilders across the Mediterranean began to adapt. The early 19th century was also a time of empire and revolution. The French under Napoleon sought to control Mediterranean waters, relying on their navy to carry armies and supplies. The British Royal Navy, determined to counter them, patrolled aggressively, keeping a watchful eye on every port and coastline. The battles fought during these years showed how important naval power remained, and so shipbuilding continued to evolve, not just for commerce, but for conflict. Yet beneath these great rivalries, everyday life carried on as always. Fishermen still required their modest boats, and coastal traders still built small vessels designed for short routes. In these boats, one can see continuity with the past, for they retain the old designs that had worked for centuries: shallow drafts for beach landings, broad hulls for stability, and lateen sails for maneuverability. While the empires dreamed of dominance, families of shipwrights still labored quietly, their knowledge rooted not in strategy, but in survival. As steam technology advanced, the Mediterranean slowly adjusted. Paddle steamers began to ferry passengers between major ports, shrinking travel times and creating new patterns of commerce. Later came screw propellers, more efficient and reliable than the earlier paddle wheels. Iron began to replace wood in hull construction, at first in limited ways, but increasingly as confidence grew. For centuries, ships had been living things of timber, shaped by hands that knew the language of trees. Now metal entered the story, and shipbuilding took on a new dimension, one that required different skills, different tools, and new forms of organization. This shift did not happen overnight. In many parts of the Mediterranean, traditional shipbuilding continued side by side with modern methods. In small harbors, wooden caiques and feluccas were still built as they had always been, their graceful forms cutting across the water in silence. But in larger cities, industrial shipyards began to rise, employing hundreds of workers and echoing with the sound of machinery. The Mediterranean had entered the industrial age, and shipbuilding reflected that transformation. Warships grew larger, heavier, and more complex. Merchant ships carried ever greater amounts of cargo, feeding the expanding global economy. Passenger steamers offered comfort and speed, turning sea travel from a slow ordeal into a reliable routine. The Mediterranean's central position meant that it remained a vital link between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and so ships of all nations passed through its waters, carrying goods, ideas, and people across continents. Yet despite all this change, echoes of the past remained. In the narrow alleys of coastal towns, one could still find small workshops where shipwrights shaped planks by hand, guided by experience rather than blueprints. In quiet coves, fishermen still pushed their boats into the surf, sails catching the same winds that had filled Phoenician and Greek vessels millennia earlier. The Mediterranean was vast enough to hold both the old and the new, to let tradition and innovation exist side by side. By the late 19th century, the sea was crowded with variety: towering steamships belching smoke on the horizon, elegant sailing ships still tracing ancient routes, nimble coastal craft darting between islands. The story of shipbuilding here had become more complex than ever, a tapestry woven of different threads: wood and iron, sail and steam, tradition and progress. Each vessel was a reflection not only of its builder, but also of its time, carrying within its hull the choices and challenges of an age in transition. And as the waves lapped against their sides, the Mediterranean continued its timeless role, cradling ships of every kind, bearing witness as humanity once again reshaped its relationship with the sea, moving steadily toward a future that was both familiar and entirely new. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Mediterranean entered yet another chapter in the long story of shipbuilding. The Industrial Revolution had already transformed the craft into an industry, and now the pace of change accelerated even further. The age of iron and steam matured into the age of steel and engines, and the old dominance of sail slipped quietly into memory. In great ports such as Marseille, Trieste, Alexandria, and Naples, vast shipyards lined the waterfronts, their cranes towering over dry docks where ships of steel took shape. These were no longer the wooden vessels of generations past, shaped plank by plank with hand tools. Instead, they were products of heavy industry, built with riveted steel plates, powered by coal-fired steam engines, and later by oil-driven turbines. The Mediterranean, once a world of lateen sails and wooden hulls, now saw great liners and cargo vessels, belching smoke as they crossed its waters, symbols of a new century's ambition. Yet even in this time of steel, the Mediterranean retained its diversity. Alongside the massive steamships, small wooden fishing boats continued to be built in villages and islands, their forms nearly unchanged from antiquity. This contrast was striking. In the same harbors, one could see both the past and the future, the delicate lines of a handmade caique rocking gently next to the imposing bulk of a steel freighter. In this way, the Mediterranean reflected a dual identity, never abandoning its traditions while embracing the technology of modernity. The two world wars further accelerated the transformation of shipbuilding. The Mediterranean became a strategic theater, and navies poured immense resources into producing warships, submarines, and transports. Shipyards worked day and night, turning out destroyers, cruisers, and troop carriers that would fight in battles stretching from Gallipoli to North Africa. These wars brought new technologies into shipbuilding. Welding replaced riveting, oil replaced coal, and radar and sonar became essential tools. The Mediterranean, with its narrow passages and vital sea routes, reminded all powers that control of the sea was still a matter of survival. After the wars, the Mediterranean entered a period of rebuilding. Trade resumed, and passenger liners once again connected Europe, Africa, and the Near East. The Suez Canal, linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, became more important than ever, making Mediterranean ports central to global commerce. Shipbuilding responded to these needs by creating larger cargo ships, tankers, and ferries. Steel was now the unquestioned material, and diesel engines became the norm. Yet amid this industrial expansion, the old rhythms of small-scale shipbuilding never disappeared. In places like the Greek islands, craftsmen still shaped fishing boats with care, using methods passed down through generations. These boats, though small, represented a continuity stretching back thousands of years, a reminder that shipbuilding in the Mediterranean was not only about great empires and global trade, but also about local life, sustenance, and survival. The 20th century also introduced containerization, a revolution in shipping that required ships to be redesigned for standardized cargo. This innovation transformed global trade and Mediterranean shipbuilding alike, pushing shipyards to create massive vessels capable of carrying thousands of containers. The Mediterranean became a highway for these giants, carrying goods between Europe, Asia, and Africa with an efficiency unimaginable in earlier centuries. Yet even as ships grew larger and more complex, the essence of shipbuilding remained the same: the careful balance of strength, stability, and purpose. Every decision, from the thickness of steel plates to the shape of a bow, reflected the same ancient question faced by the first builders of reed boats: how to move across the water safely and effectively. The Mediterranean, in its quiet persistence, bore witness to this continuity. By the late 20th century, shipbuilding here had fully entered the modern industrial era. Great shipyards employed thousands of workers, specialized in producing tankers, ferries, and naval vessels, while smaller workshops carried on their quiet traditions. The sea, patient as always, received them all. The colossal supertanker gliding slowly out of port, the naval frigate slicing swiftly through waves, the humble fishing boat bobbing gently in a sheltered bay. And in each of these ships, one could still trace the long lineage of Mediterranean shipbuilding, stretching back through the centuries to those first fragile rafts of reeds and wood. The materials had changed, the methods had advanced, but the dialogue between humanity and the sea continued, as steady and unbroken as the tide itself. As the 20th century advanced into its later decades, the Mediterranean remained a vital stage for the continuing evolution of shipbuilding, though now the changes came not in sudden bursts of invention, but in gradual refinements, adjustments, and the integration of global innovations into local traditions. The region's shipyards, once dominant in the ancient and medieval world, no longer held the same unrivaled influence, yet they still contributed to the rhythm of global commerce and naval strategy. Large industrial shipyards in countries like Italy, France, Spain, Greece, and Turkey built modern tankers, ferries, and naval vessels, while smaller coastal communities continued to preserve their centuries-old techniques of crafting wooden boats by hand. This coexistence gave the Mediterranean its distinct character in the modern era. It was a place where the past and present overlapped, where old wooden hulls floated side by side with massive steel giants. One of the most significant shifts of the mid to late 20th century was the expansion of container shipping. The adoption of standardized shipping containers, pioneered elsewhere, transformed the global maritime industry, and Mediterranean ports quickly adapted. Shipbuilders responded by designing container ships that could carry thousands of identical metal boxes, stacked like building blocks on their decks. These vessels were not beautiful in the way ancient galleys or sleek sailing ships had been, but they were efficient, and efficiency became the driving force of modern commerce. As a result, shipyards along the Mediterranean produced or modified ships to meet this demand, ensuring that the sea remained an artery of international trade. At the same time, passenger travel across the Mediterranean shifted in nature. Where once grand ocean liners carried travelers between continents, the rise of air travel reduced their importance. Yet ferries and cruise ships grew in prominence, connecting islands and coastal cities while offering leisure voyages to tourists. Shipbuilding for this purpose emphasized comfort, stability, and safety, leading to the development of large, multi-deck vessels capable of carrying thousands of passengers. These floating cities were a far cry from the war galleys and merchant cogs of earlier centuries. Yet their purpose, connecting people across the Mediterranean, remained familiar. Naval shipbuilding in the region also continued to evolve, reflecting the tensions of the Cold War and beyond. Nations bordering the Mediterranean invested in frigates, submarines, and aircraft carriers, relying on advanced technologies such as radar, sonar, and missile systems. Shipyards in France, Italy, and Spain became centers for constructing sophisticated naval fleets, ensuring that the Mediterranean remained a zone of strategic importance in modern geopolitics. For all the advances, however, the persistence of tradition was striking. In Greek islands, along the coast of Turkey, and in North African fishing towns, boat builders still used methods that would have been recognizable to their ancestors. Wooden kayaks, feluccas, and dhows were still crafted by hand, shaped according to the knowledge of wood, wind, and water passed down through generations. These boats were not relics but living vessels, adapted for local needs, symbols of a connection to the sea that had never been broken. In them we glimpse the continuity that has always defined Mediterranean shipbuilding, the ability to adapt while never entirely abandoning the old. The late 20th century also brought increasing awareness of environmental concerns. The heavy use of oil-powered engines and the rise of massive shipping fleets highlighted the ecological impact of maritime industries. Mediterranean nations began exploring cleaner technologies, from more efficient engines to early experiments with alternative fuels. Though these efforts were modest at first, they represented the beginning of yet another chapter in the long story of humanity's relationship with the sea. By the end of the century, the Mediterranean was alive with contrast and continuity. Giant container ships entered ports where small wooden fishing boats still lined the shore. Sleek naval destroyers patrolled the same waters where ferries carried tourists to sunny beaches. And in shipyards, both industrial and traditional, the same question that had always shaped shipbuilding remained: how to create vessels that could endure the sea, serve their purpose, and reflect the needs of the age. The Mediterranean, patient as always, held them all, its waves carrying the weight of steel giants and the gentle rocking of humble boats alike. In this quiet persistence, the sea reminded humanity that progress is never the abandonment of the past, but the layering of new upon old, each vessel a step in a story that had begun thousands of years earlier and still unfolded, wave by wave, into the future. As the 21st century began, the Mediterranean once more reflected the balance between tradition and innovation that had always defined its shipbuilding story. Shipyards along its coasts were now part of a global industry, competing and cooperating in the design and production of vessels that served not only the region but the wider world. In Italy, France, Spain, Turkey, and Greece, modern facilities produced advanced ferries, naval vessels, tankers, and cruise ships. While in smaller towns, craftsmen still shaped wooden fishing boats using techniques that had scarcely changed in centuries. This duality gave the Mediterranean its unique character, a sea where the latest steel hulls equipped with digital navigation systems might glide past a small hand-built boat with sails cut from cloth and masts carved by hand. The global trend toward containerization and ever larger cargo vessels transformed shipbuilding priorities. Mediterranean shipyards adapted by constructing or servicing vast container ships and tankers that could carry unimaginable amounts of goods across the globe. Ports such as Valencia, Piraeus, Marseille, and Genoa expanded their facilities, installing massive cranes and deep-water docks to accommodate these floating giants. For shipbuilders, the challenge was no longer about speed powered by sail or the maneuverability of oars, but about efficiency, fuel economy, and structural strength, ensuring that these colossal ships could travel thousands of miles while remaining safe, stable, and cost-effective. Cruise ship construction also became a defining element of Mediterranean shipbuilding in the modern era. The Mediterranean's scenic coastlines, ancient ruins, and sunlit islands attracted millions of tourists, and shipbuilders responded by creating ever larger, more luxurious vessels. These cruise ships were feats of engineering, with multiple decks, swimming pools, theaters, and restaurants. Floating cities designed not only to transport, but also to entertain. Italian shipyards in particular became leaders in constructing these modern marvels, their design blending comfort, safety, and scale in ways unimaginable to ancient shipwrights. At the same time, naval shipbuilding remained a priority for many Mediterranean states. Modern warships equipped with missile systems, stealth designs, and advanced propulsion were built in regional shipyards, ensuring that the Mediterranean remained a center of strategic importance. Shipbuilding here was no longer only about connecting markets or sustaining local economies, but also about maintaining security in a region that had been contested for millennia. Despite these advances, small-scale shipbuilding persisted. In Greek harbors, wooden keels continued to be crafted, their graceful forms unchanged from those seen in ancient pottery. In North Africa, traditional dhows still sailed with triangular lateen sails, carrying goods or serving as fishing vessels. In Turkey, small family-run shipyards maintained their heritage, producing wooden boats that embodied knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. These vessels were not built for global trade or modern warfare, but for daily life, for the same humble tasks that had sustained coastal communities for thousands of years. The Mediterranean's shipbuilding story in the modern era also began to grapple with new concerns, particularly environmental sustainability. Climate change and pollution forced a rethinking of design and propulsion. Shipbuilders experimented with cleaner fuels, hybrid engines, and energy-efficient hull shapes. Some projects even looked back to the distant past, reintroducing sails, not for tradition, but as a way to reduce fuel consumption with the help of wind power. Thus the story came full circle, blending the wisdom of ancient techniques with the demands of modern technology. By the early decades of the 21st century, the Mediterranean was filled with variety. Container ships carrying goods from Asia to Europe, cruise liners full of tourists, ferries connecting islands, naval frigates on patrol, and fishing boats returning with daily catches. In each vessel, whether colossal or humble, one could see the unbroken thread of history, stretching back to the first reed rafts and wooden planks bound together by rope. The evolution of shipbuilding here was not about a single invention or a sudden leap, but about a slow, steady accumulation of knowledge, shaped by necessity, ambition, and the eternal presence of the sea. The Mediterranean itself remained unchanged, its waves carrying forward the silent dialogue between humans and water, between ambition and endurance. And so the story of shipbuilding in this ancient sea continued, still unfolding, still reflecting the persistence of those who sought to master its waters, and still reminding us that every ship, no matter how advanced, is part of a journey that began thousands of years ago and has never truly ended. As we reach the present day, the story of shipbuilding in the Mediterranean reveals itself not as a simple line of progress, but as a long conversation between humanity and the sea, one that has endured for thousands of years and continues even now. In the harbors of Barcelona, Naples, Istanbul, and Alexandria, one can see vast steel ships rising from the docks, each the product of advanced engineering, international collaboration, and computer-aided design. These ships are symbols of modern industry, capable of carrying tens of thousands of tons of cargo, transporting passengers across oceans, or patrolling seas with high-tech weaponry. Yet only a short walk away, in smaller towns and islands, one may still find wooden boats resting on beaches or tied to old stone piers, their curved hulls shaped by hands that remember traditions far older than machines. In this coexistence lies the true character of Mediterranean shipbuilding in the 21st century. It is both ancient and modern, humble and monumental, deeply local yet unavoidably global. Today's shipbuilders face challenges their ancestors could scarcely have imagined. Environmental concerns demand cleaner fuels, quieter engines, and designs that minimize harm to marine life. The push for sustainability has led to experiments with hybrid systems, liquefied natural gas, hydrogen power, and even the reintroduction of sails as auxiliary sources of energy, recalling the wind that carried Phoenician traders and Greek triremes so long ago. Advances in digital navigation and automation mean that ships can be operated with smaller crews, guided by satellites and sensors, instead of stars and coastal landmarks. The Mediterranean, once crossed cautiously in reed rafts and wooden galleys, is now traversed by vessels whose captains can track storms, currents, and ports with the touch of a screen. Yet for all the change, the essence of shipbuilding remains the same, the shaping of vessels that can endure the sea's endless rhythm, vessels that carry not only goods and people, but also the story of human persistence. The Mediterranean still serves as a vital crossroads of trade, with ships passing daily through the Suez Canal, the Strait of Gibraltar, and countless ports large and small. Cargo ships filled with containers, tankers carrying oil and gas, ferries connecting islands, cruise ships carrying travelers in search of history and sun, and naval vessels guarding territorial waters. All share the same sea, their presence a reminder that this ancient waterway remains central to human life. Beyond commerce and defense, shipbuilding in the Mediterranean also retains a cultural and symbolic role. In festivals across Greece, Turkey, and Italy, traditional boats are still launched in ceremonies, not for trade or war, but to honor the past. Museums preserve ancient wrecks lifted from the seabed, their timbers carefully studied to understand how early builders solved the mysteries of buoyancy and balance. Scholars and craftsmen collaborate to reconstruct ancient vessels, sometimes even sailing them to test their seaworthiness, bringing history back to life in a tangible way. These efforts remind us that shipbuilding here is not only about industry, but also about memory, about honoring the continuity of human experience across generations. In the quiet harbors at dusk, as small boats return with their catch and the lights of distant cargo ships blink on the horizon, one can sense the unbroken dialogue between humans and the sea. Each ship, whether a massive container carrier or a simple wooden boat, is part of the same long tradition, part of the same effort to cross water, to connect lives, to endure uncertainty. The Mediterranean has seen it all: the first tentative rafts, the proud fleets of empires, the galleys of republics, the steamers of industry, and the steel giants of today. Its waves have carried dreams, ambitions, victories, and defeats, and they still carry them patiently without hurry. The story of shipbuilding in the Mediterranean is, in truth, a story of humanity itself. Our need to move, to trade, to explore, to defend, to survive, and to connect. It is a story that will never truly end. For as long as there are coasts and harbors, as long as people look out across the horizon and wonder what lies beyond, ships will be built and the Mediterranean will receive them. And so, as we close this journey through time, we are reminded that the sea is not conquered but shared, not mastered but negotiated, not owned but lived with. Every vessel launched upon it is a quiet promise between builder and water, a promise that echoes the countless generations who came before, and a promise that will carry forward, wave by wave, into the future. And so, our story has gently come to an end. Before we drift into the next chapter, may I kindly ask you to leave a like and subscribe. It helps this quiet space continue. Now let us move forward together, still calm, still unhurried, as we begin the next tale in our Boring History for Sleep series, the slow spread of navigation tools. Long before compasses pointed north, before charts were drawn with precision, and long before sextants measured the angle of stars. Sailors who ventured into the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, or the Indian Ocean had only their senses and courage to guide them. The earliest navigators did not possess what we now call instruments. Their tools were the winds, the currents, the color of the water, and the patterns of the birds in the sky. For thousands of years, seafaring was an art of observation rather than calculation, and it was an art learned slowly, painfully, and often at great cost. To begin this story, we must imagine the earliest seafarers standing at the edge of their known world, staring at a vast horizon of water. With no compass in hand, no map to consult, they looked instead at the rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the endless repetition of the stars. In these patterns they found orientation, even if only in rough form. The North Star, Polaris, offered a fixed point in the heavens for those in the northern hemisphere, and it became one of the first and simplest guides for direction. Yet for many centuries, even this knowledge spread slowly, confined to cultures that watched the night sky with care and passed their observations to the next generation. In the Mediterranean, Phoenician sailors are believed to have mastered early stellar navigation. Their voyages along the coasts of Africa and across to the Iberian Peninsula were guided in part by their ability to read the heavens. The Greeks, inheriting and adapting this knowledge, wrote about navigation by stars, though much of it remained limited to those who lived their lives at sea. Meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean, Arab and Persian sailors developed their own techniques, combining knowledge of the stars with an understanding of seasonal winds, the monsoons that dictated when ships could safely cross from East Africa to India and beyond. These early methods were not instruments in the sense we understand them today, but they were tools nonetheless. Mental maps of skies and seas sharpened through repetition. Over time, as trade expanded and voyages lengthened, the need for more reliable navigation became clear. Simple devices such as the gnomon, a vertical stick used to measure the sun's shadow, or the kamal, a piece of wood with a string used by Arab sailors to estimate latitude, began to appear. These were modest aids, yet they represented a shift from pure observation toward measurable technique. Still, their use spread gradually, often confined to certain regions or groups of sailors, and it would take centuries before such knowledge became widespread. Maps, too, were part of the slow evolution. Early charts were not precise geographic representations, but rather symbolic guides, known as portolan charts, which began appearing in the late medieval Mediterranean. These maps emphasized coastlines, harbors, and landmarks useful to sailors, filled with compass roses and radiating lines to suggest directions. They were valuable but limited, useful primarily for coastal sailing where landmarks could still be seen. Out in the open sea, far from land, sailors continued to rely more on stars, winds, and intuition than on any chart. This slow spread of navigational knowledge reminds us of how resistant the sea has always been to certainty. Unlike land with its fixed paths and markers, the ocean is fluid and shifting. Currents change, winds shift, and storms erase all memory of direction. Each tool that emerged was not a sudden invention, but part of a long, patient process of trial and error. Even the compass, often thought of as a timeless instrument, entered European waters only after centuries of use in China and later adoption through Arab intermediaries. When it did arrive, it spread gradually, first among certain traders, then among navies, and only much later becoming a standard feature on ships. In these earliest stages, navigation was not a science, but a mixture of experience, tradition, and occasional aid from simple tools. A sailor's memory was itself a tool, a living record of coastlines, harbors, and patterns of waves. Knowledge moved slowly, carried not by books, but by the spoken word, from master to apprentice, from old sailor to young. And so, across centuries, humanity inched forward, learning to cross the seas with ever greater confidence, yet always humbled by the vastness of water and sky. The slow spread of navigation tools is in many ways a story of patience, of small steps that accumulated over time. It shows us that progress was never a single leap, but a gradual unfolding, shaped as much by human need as by the stubborn mysteries of the sea. As centuries passed, the development and spread of navigation tools continued at an unhurried pace, shaped less by sudden leaps of invention and more by the gradual sharing of knowledge across cultures. One of the earliest and most influential instruments to appear in the Mediterranean world, was the astrolabe, adapted from earlier Greek concepts of astronomy and later refined by Islamic scholars. The astrolabe was not invented for sailors alone. It was a versatile device used for studying the heavens, calculating time, and solving geometric problems. Yet mariners quickly discovered its usefulness at sea. By aligning its movable arm with a star, they could measure altitude and estimate latitude. This meant that for the first time, sailors could anchor their journeys not only to the shifting appearance of the coast, but to the fixed order of the sky. The spread of the astrolabe, however, was slow. Its use required training, and in an age when literacy itself was not widespread, only a limited number of sailors or navigators could master it. Often it was in the hands of pilots hired specifically for long voyages, men who guarded their knowledge carefully, passing it down selectively. Meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean, Arab sailors employed the kamal, a far simpler but equally ingenious tool. It consisted of a small wooden tablet attached to a string with knots at intervals. By holding the string in the teeth and aligning the tablet with the horizon and a specific star, a sailor could estimate latitude with surprising accuracy. The kamal's simplicity made it more accessible than the astrolabe, and its use spread gradually among those who crossed the monsoon seas between Arabia, India, and East Africa. Though separated by geography, these different approaches reveal how cultures developed tools suited to their environments, and how knowledge moved not in sudden waves, but in quiet, measured ripples. In medieval Europe, another important development was the refinement of the magnetic compass. Originating in China centuries earlier, the compass likely reached the Mediterranean through overland trade and later through contact with Arab seafarers. At first, it was little more than a magnetized needle floating in water or mounted on a simple card. But even this crude device offered a tremendous advantage. It pointed consistently in one direction, providing a guide when the sky was overcast or the coastline invisible. Yet, as with other tools, its adoption was gradual. Sailors trusted their eyes and their memory more than a small piece of metal, and it took centuries of trial, error, and growing confidence before the compass became a regular companion on European ships. Portolan charts, appearing in the 13th century, represented another step. These detailed coastal maps, marked with compass roses and radiating lines, helped sailors plan routes with greater confidence. They were works of art as well as practical guides, filled with colorful illustrations of harbors, cities, and mythical creatures said to inhabit the seas. Still, they were most useful for coastal navigation, where landmarks could confirm their accuracy. In the wide expanse of open water, they offered little certainty. What becomes clear in tracing this history is that tools did not spread simply because they existed. Each required time to be accepted, understood, and integrated into daily practice. Sailors, by necessity, were cautious. The sea punished mistakes harshly, and new methods were adopted only after repeated proof. The result was a patchwork. Some crews used astrolabes, others relied on kamals. Still others trusted only their compass, and many used nothing more than the stars and their memories. Slowly, however, the combination of these tools began to form a shared foundation for navigation. By the late medieval period, a skilled navigator might carry a small set of instruments, an astrolabe, a compass, perhaps a cross staff for measuring angles, and rely on them in concert with charts, winds, and stars. This was not yet science in the modern sense, but a growing art of measurement that added layers of confidence to ancient traditions. The Mediterranean, with its constant movement of traders, pilgrims, and armies, acted as a crossroads where knowledge of navigation tools mingled and spread. From Arab sailors came the kamal and refinements of the astrolabe. From Asia came the compass, from European workshops came charts and staffs, and from every voyage came new observations and adjustments. Yet despite these exchanges, progress remained slow, for the sea itself was never hurried. Each innovation was tested over generations, becoming part of a careful tradition that sought not to conquer the ocean, but to coexist with it. In this way, navigation tools spread like the tide itself, steady, deliberate, and unceasing. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the slow spread of navigation tools began to accelerate, though always in measured steps rather than sudden leaps. The Mediterranean, long a crossroads of cultures, remained central to this process. Traders, explorers, and scholars moved knowledge from port to port, weaving together traditions from east and west. One of the most significant developments of this period was the cross staff, a simple wooden device that allowed sailors to measure the angle between a celestial body and the horizon. It was made of a long staff with sliding cross pieces, and by aligning it with a star or the sun, navigators could estimate latitude more reliably than by memory alone. Though crude compared to later instruments, the cross staff was practical and spread gradually among mariners. It did not replace older methods immediately, but joined them, adding another layer to the sailor's toolkit. As with earlier devices, its use required training and experience, for holding it correctly at sea was not easy, especially on a deck that pitched and rolled with the waves. Yet with time, those who mastered it gained a new sense of confidence when venturing beyond the sight of land. Another invention, the backstaff, appeared in the 16th century as an improvement, allowing sailors to take measurements of the sun without looking directly at it. This refinement reflects a common theme in the story of navigation. Each tool did not render the old obsolete overnight, but instead emerged as a cautious step forward, refined slowly, tested patiently, and spread only after trust was earned. Alongside these instruments, the magnetic compass continued to evolve. Mariners refined its housing, suspending the needle in protective boxes, stabilizing it with gimbals so it could remain level even as the ship rolled. Compass roses became more detailed, dividing the circle into 32 points, and navigators began to rely on them not just for general direction, but for more precise course plotting. Still, the compass was not infallible. Variations caused by local magnetic fields created errors, and many sailors continued to trust the stars above more than the quivering needle. Only gradually did confidence in the compass become widespread, and even then it was often used in combination with celestial observation, rather than as a standalone guide. Maps and charts also saw major advances in this period. Portolan charts of earlier centuries were now joined by more sophisticated maps that attempted to represent coastlines and distances with greater accuracy. Printing technology, spreading in the 15th century, made it possible to reproduce maps more widely, reducing the reliance on hand-copied manuscripts. Even so, maps were expensive, guarded carefully, and often treated as state secrets by maritime powers eager to protect their trade routes. In this way, the spread of cartographic knowledge remained slow, uneven, and controlled. Another reminder that the history of navigation was never simply about invention, but also about access and transmission. The sextant, which would eventually become one of the most iconic instruments of navigation, had its origins in the same gradual process. Though perfected only in the 18th century, its conceptual roots can be traced to earlier devices, like the cross staff and backstaff. By using mirrors to measure the angle of celestial bodies with great precision, the sextant allowed navigators to determine latitude with an accuracy previously unimaginable. Yet even when introduced, it did not spread instantly. Training was required, production was expensive, and adoption came step by step. As sailors and navies proved its worth, the story of these tools is not one of sudden transformation, but of slow accumulation. Each culture contributed pieces, the Arabs refining the astrolabe, the Chinese pioneering the compass, the Europeans crafting cross staffs and sextants, and the Mediterranean serving as a meeting ground where knowledge mingled, adapted, and diffused. At every stage, sailors still relied on experience and memory, for no tool alone could tame the sea. Instruments could guide, but storms, currents, and human error always demanded judgment. It was this combination of tradition and innovation that defined the era. By the time of the Renaissance, navigation tools had become more common, yet they were still far from universal. Many ships sailed with little more than a compass and the skill of their pilot, while others carried a fuller set of instruments. The spread was uneven, reflecting the cautious pace at which seafarers adopted new methods. But with each voyage, each measured angle, each course corrected by a compass needle, the art of navigation moved forward. The Mediterranean, as it had for millennia, remained the patient witness to the slow unfolding, its waters carrying ships guided by tools that were both ancient and new, simple and sophisticated, always evolving, always spreading, one step at a time. By the 17th century, the slow and steady spread of navigation tools had created a new era of maritime confidence, yet the process was still uneven, and mastery remained the privilege of a few. Instruments such as the astrolabe, the cross staff, and the compass were now more common, but they had not fully displaced the reliance on experience, intuition, and memory. The Mediterranean continued to serve as both a laboratory and a crossroads, where ships from Spain, Venice, Genoa, the Ottoman Empire, and North Africa all carried variations of these tools, blending them with local practices. The result was a patchwork of methods, some ancient, some modern, all coexisting on the same waters. One of the most telling developments of this period was the increasing importance of mathematical and astronomical training for navigators. Universities and academies began to include navigation in their curricula, while naval powers like Spain, Portugal, and later France and England established specialized schools to train pilots. Yet this knowledge spread slowly, often restricted by language, cost, and politics. A sailor in a small fishing boat off the coast of Sicily or Crete was unlikely to hold a sextant or a detailed chart, relying instead on winds and landmarks, while a royal navigator aboard a fleet flagship might carry the latest refinements of European craftsmanship. In this way, the story of navigation tools was also a story of inequality, where access to instruments shaped the ability to venture farther from shore. The backstaff, introduced in the late 16th century, offered another step forward. Its clever design allowed sailors to measure the altitude of the sun while keeping their eyes safely away from its glare, and its adoption spread slowly but steadily across the Mediterranean and beyond. It was lighter and easier to use than the astrolabe, and its wooden construction made it affordable to produce. Still, like every tool before it, its acceptance required years of practice and demonstration. Sailors are cautious by necessity, and every instrument had to prove itself across countless voyages before it became trusted. At the same time, cartography advanced. Mapmakers incorporated new reports from explorers, correcting coastlines and expanding the known world. Printing made charts more accessible, though still not cheap, and many states continued to treat detailed maps as secrets of the crown. Portolan charts, filled with compass roses and radiating lines, were joined by more scientifically drawn maps that attempted to capture latitude and longitude with increasing accuracy. Yet longitude remained an unsolved problem, and for centuries sailors had no reliable way to measure it. Latitude could be found by stars or the sun, but longitude required precise timekeeping, and until the 18th century, no tool existed that could keep accurate time at sea. As a result, even the best-equipped ships often found themselves uncertain of their exact position, a reminder that navigation was never free from uncertainty. Another tool that began to appear in this era was the log line, a simple rope with knots tied at intervals, attached to a piece of wood thrown into the water. By counting how many knots passed through a sailor's hands in a set period of time, navigators could estimate speed. This gave rise to the very term knots still used today for measuring velocity at sea. Though simple, the log line represented yet another slow step toward more systematic navigation. As with other tools, its use spread gradually, first among larger fleets and then much later among smaller vessels. In the Mediterranean, where voyages were often shorter and coasts more familiar, it was adopted slowly, but over time it became part of the standard equipment of seafaring. The 17th century also saw the rise of naval power on a new scale. Fleets grew larger, wars became more complex, and the need for reliable navigation became urgent. States invested in better training, better instruments, and better charts, but the spread of these resources was uneven. The Ottoman fleet, for example, relied heavily on tradition and experience, while European powers increasingly leaned on mathematical precision. The coexistence of these approaches highlights the central theme. Progress was never uniform, never immediate, but always layered, with the old and new existing side by side. By the end of the 17th century, navigation tools were more widespread than ever before, yet they had not erased uncertainty. A storm could still scatter a fleet, a clouded sky could still render instruments useless, and a single miscalculation could send a ship onto unseen rocks. What they had achieved, however, was to give sailors a greater sense of confidence, a belief that the sea could be measured, if never fully mastered. The Mediterranean, as it had for millennia, bore witness to these changes, watching patiently as each generation of shipbuilders and navigators added their voices to the long conversation with the sea. And so the slow spread of navigation tools continued, each new device joining the centuries-old dialogue, shaping not only how ships moved across the water, but how humans imagined their relationship with the world beyond the horizon. As the 18th century unfolded, the slow march of navigational progress reached a critical point, for although latitude could be measured with some degree of confidence using tools like the astrolabe, cross-staff, or sextant, longitude remained a mystery that frustrated sailors and scholars alike. To know where one was from north to south was manageable, but to determine one's position east to west was far more difficult. For centuries, ships relied on dead reckoning, estimating their position by keeping track of direction, speed, and time since leaving port. But dead reckoning was imprecise and easily distorted by winds, currents, and storms. This uncertainty often meant that ships could miss their destinations by hundreds of miles or run aground on unknown coasts. The problem of longitude became one of the most pressing scientific challenges of the age, and attempts to solve it tell us much about the slow spread of navigational tools. The solution came not from the stars, but from time itself. If one could know the exact time at a reference point, such as the port from which a voyage began, and compare it with the local time, measured by the position of the sun, longitude could be calculated. The difficulty lay in building a clock accurate enough to keep time at sea, unaffected by the constant motion of a ship, the salt air, and the variations of temperature. For generations, attempts failed, until the 18th century when John Harrison, a self-taught English carpenter and clockmaker, developed marine chronometers that could keep precise time during long voyages. These chronometers slowly transformed navigation, but their adoption was gradual. At first, they were expensive and limited to the navies and merchant fleets of wealthy nations. It took decades before they spread more widely, and even then many sailors continued to rely on older methods, wary of new technology and reluctant to abandon the familiar art of dead reckoning. In the Mediterranean, where voyages were often shorter and coasts more familiar than in the Atlantic, the chronometer spread slowly, joining rather than replacing other instruments. Yet in time, its value became clear. With accurate time, longitude could be measured, and with longitude, charts could be corrected, and voyages planned with greater precision than ever before. Alongside the chronometer, the sextant emerged as the standard tool for measuring celestial angles. More precise and easier to use than earlier devices, it allowed navigators to calculate latitude with accuracy that astonished their predecessors. When paired with a chronometer, the sextant became part of a new system of navigation, one that combined the heavens and the clock to create a more reliable picture of the world. Even so, the spread of these tools remained uneven. Wealthy navies and trading companies equipped their fleets, but smaller vessels, especially those plying the familiar waters of the Mediterranean, often continued with simpler instruments or none at all. A fisherman in a caique off Crete, or a trader sailing between Marseille and Barcelona, had little need of a chronometer when the landmarks of the coast provided all the orientation required. Thus, the 18th century saw not a uniform revolution, but a layering of methods, with advanced tools slowly filtering into practice, while older traditions remained strong. This gradual pace reflects the larger theme. Navigation was always cautious, always tested by experience, and never quick to abandon what had worked before. The slow spread of these tools also highlights the human element. Instruments alone were not enough. They required knowledge, training, and trust. Schools of navigation expanded in this period, teaching sailors how to use sextants, read charts, and calculate positions with mathematical precision. Yet these skills spread as slowly as the tools themselves, limited by cost, access, and the realities of seafaring life. In this way, the 18th century represents a delicate balance between tradition and innovation, between the ancient art of reading the sea and the modern science of measuring it. By the end of the century, the foundations of modern navigation had been laid, but their presence was not universal. The Mediterranean remained a sea of contrasts, where grand warships carried chronometers and sextants, while small wooden boats sailed with little more than memory and instinct. This contrast, far from being a weakness, was part of the richness of maritime history. It shows us that progress was not about sudden replacement, but about coexistence, where old and new lived side by side, each serving the needs of those who trusted them. And so the slow spread of navigation tools continued, each generation carrying forward a mixture of past and present, shaping a maritime world that was more precise than before, yet still rooted in the timeless dialogue between human beings and the sea. As the 19th century began, the world of navigation was slowly entering a new age, though always at the cautious pace that had defined its long history. The combination of the sextant and the marine chronometer offered a level of accuracy unimaginable to earlier sailors, and yet their adoption across the Mediterranean and beyond was not instant but gradual. Navies and large merchant fleets embraced them first, while smaller vessels, local traders, and fishermen often continued to rely on memory, coastal landmarks, and simpler tools. This duality of old practices alongside new instruments gave the Mediterranean its characteristic blend of continuity and change. The chronometer in particular reshaped navigation, for with accurate timekeeping, longitude could finally be calculated with confidence. But these early chronometers were expensive, delicate, and required careful maintenance. A single ship might carry only one, or perhaps two, and sailors often guarded them with the utmost care. Even so, the chronometer became the foundation for more precise charts, as explorers and surveyors used them to correct coastlines, harbors, and distances with a reliability never before possible. Slowly, maps became less works of art and more instruments of science, each line of latitude and longitude a reflection of careful measurement rather than rough estimation. The sextant, refined over decades, became a trusted companion of navigators. Its mirrors and arcs allowed for precise readings of the sun and stars, and when combined with time from the chronometer, positions could be fixed with remarkable accuracy. Still, mastery of the sextant was not simple. It required steady hands, mathematical skill, and the patience to practice over countless voyages. As a result, training became more formalized. Naval academies and maritime schools expanded their curricula, teaching young officers the art and science of celestial navigation. Yet for all its promise, the spread of this knowledge was never complete. Many ordinary sailors relied on the expertise of a single navigator or pilot aboard their ship, leaving the wider crew dependent on that person's skill. The 19th century also witnessed the rise of hydrographic surveys, systematic efforts to chart coasts, measure depths, and record hazards. Governments invested in these surveys, sending out ships dedicated not to trade or war, but to the patient accumulation of data. The Mediterranean, with its busy harbors, narrow straits, and hidden shoals, was mapped in greater detail than ever before. But even as charts grew more precise, they remained limited by the ability of shipyards and sailors to access them. Some captains could afford the latest updates, while others sailed with outdated or incomplete charts, a reminder that the spread of navigational progress was always uneven. Another important development of this era was the improvement of log lines and the introduction of mechanical logs to measure speed more consistently. While the simple rope and knot method had served for centuries, newer instruments used rotating vanes dragged through the water, their revolutions translated into speed. These devices made dead reckoning slightly more accurate, but again, their use spread slowly, and many ships clung to the old methods. The 19th century also brought with it the rise of steamships, which changed not only shipbuilding, but also navigation itself. Steam power freed vessels from complete dependence on wind, allowing for more predictable courses and timetables. Yet navigation remained essential, for even a steamship could run aground without proper guidance. As these vessels multiplied across the Mediterranean, lighthouses, buoys, and other aids to navigation were built along coasts, further assisting sailors. These fixed markers represented another kind of tool, not carried aboard ships, but spread across the landscape, part of the slow layering of assistance that made the sea a little less uncertain. Despite all these advances, the essence of navigation in the 19th century remained one of patience and caution. Instruments were refined, knowledge expanded, and confidence grew, but mistakes could still be fatal, storms could still scatter fleets, and human error could still undo the best of tools. The slow spread of navigation instruments was not about sudden mastery, but about steady accumulation, about building trust over time. By the end of the century, the Mediterranean was alive with contrasts. Massive steamships carrying chronometers and sextants side by side, with humble wooden boats guided by memory and stars, grand charts in the hands of naval officers, and simple compasses hanging from the belts of fishermen. Each vessel reflected its place in this long story, each voyage a part of the unbroken dialogue between human ambition and the mystery of the sea. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the slow spread of navigation tools entered yet another stage of transformation. The old instruments of celestial navigation, the sextant and the chronometer, were still in use, cherished by sailors for their precision and reliability. Yet new technologies, born of the industrial and scientific revolutions, began to alter the way ships moved across the seas. In the Mediterranean, where ancient routes remained alive with commerce, war, and travel, these changes came gradually but steadily, once again layering new tools upon old traditions. One of the most significant shifts was the rise of radio. By the early 20th century, wireless telegraphy allowed ships to communicate across distances that had once isolated them completely. This development did not erase the need for sextants or charts, but it added a new dimension to navigation: the ability to call for help, to receive weather reports, and to synchronize time more accurately. Time, as always, remained at the heart of navigation, and with radio signals sent from shore stations, ships could check their chronometers and correct them, reducing the risk of error. The spread of radio navigation was gradual, beginning with large naval and passenger vessels, then moving slowly into merchant fleets. Smaller fishing boats and coastal traders continued without it for decades, still tied to the stars and their memories. In this way, the old rhythm of uneven progress continued, with advanced tools appearing first in the service of empires and large companies, before slowly filtering outward. Another key development was the refinement of charts and hydrographic data. National hydrographic offices, established in the 19th century, expanded their surveys in the 20th, producing maps of greater precision. Depth soundings, tide tables, and current charts became more widely available. With echo sounding introduced in the 1920s, ships could now measure depths directly, using sound waves instead of lead lines. This was a quiet revolution, reducing the danger of unseen shoals and allowing more confidence in shallow or unfamiliar waters. Yet echo-sounding equipment was costly, and again its spread was slow, limited at first to larger ships. Smaller vessels continued to carry the traditional lead line, dropping it into the sea and feeling the bottom with a practiced hand, a method unchanged for centuries. Lighthouses and coastal beacons also expanded in this period, supported by new engineering and electricity. The Mediterranean coasts, lined with these steady lights, offered reassurance to sailors who had for millennia looked for flames, torches, or fires to guide them. Now electric lamps burned brighter and farther, visible for miles, and their beams were coded in patterns so that each could be distinguished from another. These too were navigation tools, though fixed upon land, part of the broader system of guidance that slowly made the sea less uncertain. The 20th century also brought the challenge of two world wars, in which navigation became not only a matter of trade and travel, but of survival. Navies invested heavily in instruments and training. Dead reckoning, celestial navigation, radio bearings, and soundings were all combined to guide fleets and convoys. The Mediterranean, contested in both wars, became a proving ground for these methods. Submarines prowled its depths, aircraft patrolled its skies, and ships relied on every available tool to navigate safely under constant threat. The wars accelerated the spread of radio direction finding, which allowed ships to fix their positions by triangulating signals from known stations. Yet even in this time of rapid innovation, older tools were never fully abandoned. Sailors still carried sextants, still trusted their charts, and still measured the sun and stars whenever possible. The slow pace of acceptance remained, not because new tools lacked promise, but because the sea demanded caution. Trust was earned only through time and repeated use. After the wars, as the Mediterranean rebuilt, navigation entered an era of greater integration. Radio navigation systems like LORAN, developed during the conflict, began to spread in peacetime, offering long-range position fixes based on radio signals. Merchant fleets, passenger liners, and later fishing vessels slowly adopted these systems, though again the process was gradual, shaped by cost, training, and access. Even as new signals crossed the airwaves, sextants remained in use, kept as backups, respected for their independence from technology. By the mid-20th century, the Mediterranean was alive with contrasts. Great passenger ships using radio direction finding, naval vessels equipped with radar, and small wooden boats still watching the stars. The story remained one of layers, where the new did not erase the old, but joined it, forming a tapestry of methods that reflected both innovation and tradition. This was, and remains, the essence of the slow spread of navigation tools. Each step, whether the simple lead line, the careful arc of the sextant, or the crackling voice over a radio, added to the sailor's ability to face the uncertainty of the sea. And the Mediterranean, patient and timeless, carried them all across its waters, bearing witness to the steady rhythm of progress that was never hurried, never complete, always unfolding wave by wave, generation by generation. As the 20th century advanced into its later decades, navigation entered a period of profound yet still gradual transformation. The sea was no longer only measured by the stars or marked by the beams of lighthouses. Invisible signals now filled the air, weaving unseen paths across the Mediterranean. Radio navigation systems like LORAN had spread slowly, providing long-range fixes by timing the difference between signals from multiple stations. In practice, this meant that ships could know their position with a precision that earlier generations could hardly imagine. Yet, as always, the spread was uneven. Large cargo vessels and naval ships carried the equipment, while many smaller vessels continued with sextants, compasses, and charts. The sea remained a place of contrasts, where the modern and the ancient shared the same waters. Radar, developed during the Second World War, also began to transform navigation. By bouncing radio waves off surrounding objects, ships could see coastlines, other vessels, and even rain squalls in darkness or fog. This new way of sensing the world was revolutionary, but radar sets were expensive and required training. For many years, they were confined to larger ships. Smaller traders and fishermen continued to navigate, as their ancestors had, using landmarks by day, stars by night, and their memory always. Thus, the slow spread of navigation tools was visible even in an age of rapid invention. Innovation came first to the powerful, then only gradually to everyone else. By the 1960s and 1970s, the world saw the emergence of satellite technology. The first systems, like transit, developed for military use, allowed submarines and later surface ships to calculate their positions from signals sent by satellites passing overhead. This was a step toward what would later become the global positioning system. But in its early years, transit was limited, and its adoption in the Mediterranean was slow, constrained by cost and the specialized nature of the equipment. Sextants, chronometers, and charts were still the standard for most sailors, and indeed many considered them more reliable than machines that could fail or signals that might disappear. During this period, the culture of seamanship also preserved tradition. Navigation schools continued to teach celestial navigation, not as a quaint relic, but as a vital backup. For many believed that no matter how advanced tools became, the stars and the sun would always remain the sailor's most trustworthy guides. Thus, even as radio, radar, and satellites spread, the sextant never disappeared from the navigator's chest, and the chronometer still ticked faithfully in its gimbal box. In Mediterranean harbors, the contrast grew sharper. Cruise liners carried radar, radio direction finders, and early satellite receivers, while just across the quay, wooden fishing boats still left at dawn with little more than a compass and the memory of currents. Yet both shared the same waters, and both reflected the layered nature of progress. Each tool joined the long chain of human attempts to read the sea, each spreading slowly, each building upon the old without entirely erasing it. The late 20th century also brought an expansion of global shipping that made accurate navigation more essential than ever. Containerization, which revolutionized maritime trade, required precise timetables and efficient routes. The Mediterranean, a central link between Europe, Asia, and Africa, became crowded with massive container ships, tankers, and ferries. For these vessels, the adoption of modern navigation systems was essential, and shipyards and crews alike adapted. But smaller coastal traders, fishing fleets, and local ferries often lagged behind, adopting new tools only when cost and necessity made them unavoidable. This slow pace of diffusion, though frustrating to some, was in fact typical of maritime history, where tradition and caution always tempered innovation. By the closing decades of the 20th century, the Mediterranean was a sea of layers. ships equipped with radar and satellites sailed alongside those guided by stars and charts. Electronic signals intersected with centuries-old knowledge of winds and currents. And always, the sea remained patient, watching as each generation of sailors added new tools to its long dialogue. The slow spread of navigation tools was not a tale of sudden conquest, but of coexistence, a reminder that the ocean demands respect, and that each advance, however powerful, must prove itself against the vastness of water and sky. By the time the 21st century dawned, navigation had entered an age of satellites, signals, and digital screens. Yet the pace of change on the sea still carried the same rhythm it always had, gradual, layered, and uneven. And the Global Positioning System, or GPS, became the most transformative tool of the modern era, offering instant positions anywhere on Earth with an accuracy unimaginable to sailors of earlier centuries. But even GPS, like every tool before it, did not erase older methods immediately. The sextant still found its place aboard many vessels as a backup. Chronometers still ticked in navigation rooms, and charts, now printed in greater detail than ever or displayed electronically on screens, remained essential companions. In the Mediterranean, the adoption of GPS and related technologies reflected the sea's diversity. Large commercial ships, from container carriers to cruise liners, installed GPS receivers as soon as they became available, integrating them with radar, automatic identification systems, and computerized charts. These tools allowed for precise route planning, efficient fuel use, and safer navigation through crowded waters such as the Strait of Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, and the Bosporus. Yet smaller vessels, whether fishing boats off Sicily, ferries in the Greek islands, or traditional dhows along the North African coast, often lagged behind, adopting GPS only gradually as devices became more affordable. For years, many sailors still trusted their eyes, their memories of coasts, and the tools their fathers had used before them. The slow spread of navigation tools was still evident, even in the digital age. Alongside GPS came electronic chart display and information systems, known as ECDAS. These screens combined satellite positions with digital maps, allowing navigators to see their ship's location in real time, overlaid with depth soundings, hazards, and traffic. To modernize, this seemed a revolution, yet its spread was not instant. Regulations required it first on large international vessels, while smaller ships continued to use paper charts or basic GPS units. Just as in earlier centuries, the newest tools appeared first in the fleets of wealthy nations and companies, filtering slowly into everyday use. Other technologies, such as the Automatic Identification System, or AIS, which broadcasts a ship's name, position, and speed to nearby vessels, further reduced the dangers of collision in crowded waters. In the Mediterranean, where traffic is dense and routes are narrow, AIS became invaluable. But again, it spread in steps, mandatory for larger ships, optional, and later slowly adopted by smaller ones. Each tool, no matter how advanced, had to earn its place in the daily rhythm of the sea. Yet even as satellites circled overhead and digital screens glowed in wheelhouses, tradition persisted. Navigation schools continued to teach celestial navigation, reminding students that GPS signals could fail or be jammed, that batteries could die and screens could go dark. And so, on many ships, sextants were still carried, not as relics, but as reminders of a skill that had guided humanity for centuries. In the Mediterranean, this coexistence was especially visible. A vast container ship leaving Piraeus might be guided by a network of satellites, while not far away, a small caïque might set out with little more than a compass and the knowledge of winds and currents inherited from generations. The two vessels, so different in scale and equipment, were both part of the same long story, each shaped by the slow spread of tools that had never replaced one another fully, but had layered themselves across time. Environmental concerns also began to influence navigation in the modern era. Tools that optimized fuel use, charted the most efficient routes, and reduced emissions became standard in larger fleets. These too spread slowly, first mandated by international regulations, then gradually adopted more widely. In this way, even the newest age of digital navigation echoed the same pattern seen in the past. Innovation tested, proven, and then, step by step, accepted. By the early decades of the 21st century, the Mediterranean had become a living museum of navigation's evolution. In its harbors, one could see gleaming cruise ships with satellite domes beside humble wooden boats with patched sails, each relying on a different mixture of tools, old and new. The slow spread of navigation tools, stretching from the first star maps to digital satellites, was still unfolding, proving once again that progress at sea is never sudden but always patient, shaped by trust, need, and the eternal dialogue between humanity and the ocean. As we arrive at the present day, the long story of navigation tools reveals itself as a patient unfolding, never a sudden leap, but always a layering of new upon old. The Mediterranean, cradle of so many traditions, remains a stage where this history can be seen most clearly. Here, GPS satellites beam signals across the sky, their accuracy measured in meters, guiding container ships and cruise liners with confidence. Yet in the same harbors, wooden kayaks still set sail with compasses, paper charts, and the knowledge of stars. This coexistence of the ancient and the modern shows that the slow spread of navigation tools has not ended but continues, shaped by the same forces that have always defined seafaring: cost, necessity, tradition, and trust. Modern systems now integrate multiple tools into seamless networks. A vessel in the Mediterranean today may rely on GPS, radar, echo sounders, automatic identification systems, and digital chart displays, all working together. Computers suggest routes that minimize fuel use, avoid storms, and meet schedules. Yet despite the sophistication of these systems, every professional mariner is taught to keep backups, to know how to read a paper chart, to understand celestial navigation, and to prepare for the possibility that signals could fail. The sea still demands humility, and it resists overconfidence. This is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the slow spread of navigation tools. Each new instrument adds confidence, but none has erased uncertainty entirely. The Mediterranean continues to illustrate this balance. In the busy Strait of Gibraltar, traffic separation schemes are plotted with digital precision, while along the coast of Tunisia or the islands of Greece, fishermen may still watch the flight of birds and the color of the water to find their way home. On naval ships, advanced inertial navigation systems operate even when GPS is denied, while in small villages, boat builders continue to teach apprentices how to use a compass, a lead line, and the stars. The layering of tools is not only a matter of technology, but also of culture. Navigation has always been a human practice, and tools spread only as fast as people accept them. Trust must be built, and tradition rarely disappears quickly. That is why even now, centuries after the invention of the chronometer, many captains still wind them daily, keeping their steady tick as a reassuring companion. That is why sextants remain in lockers, their brass polished and their arcs intact, ready to be used when electronics falter. The slow spread of tools is not a weakness, but a strength, for it ensures that knowledge is never wholly dependent on one method, one signal, or one fragile device. Looking ahead, new technologies continue to emerge. Satellite constellations beyond GPS, such as Galileo in Europe, Beidou in China, and GLONASS in Russia, now provide redundancy. Electronic navigation charts grow more detailed, updated in real time. Experiments with autonomous ships test whether vessels can cross seas without human hands at the helm. And yet, even in this imagined future, the Mediterranean will likely continue to host both the most advanced ships and the humblest boats, each navigating according to its needs, each carrying forward the legacy of slow adoption. The sea itself enforces this patience. Unlike land, where roads are fixed and signs are certain, the ocean shifts endlessly. Winds change, currents surprise, and storms remind humanity that no tool is perfect. For this reason, the spread of navigation technology will always be measured, tested, and layered, never instant. The story that began with the first reed boats looking to the stars has not ended. It continues with satellites circling the Earth, with signals crossing the sky, with screens glowing in wheelhouses at night, and with old hands still pointing to constellations that guided their ancestors. In every harbor of the Mediterranean, one can sense this continuity. The slow spread of navigation tools is, in the end, a story of endurance. It shows how humanity, faced with the vastness of the sea, has always responded with patience, ingenuity, and care. From the gnomon to the camal, from the astrolabe to the sextant, from the compass to the chronometer, From the lead line to the radar, from the radio beacon to the satellite, each tool has taken its place alongside the others, never replacing but always adding, never erasing but always layering. And so, as the waves of the Mediterranean continue their eternal rhythm, lapping against the shores of Europe, Africa, and Asia, they remind us that progress at sea is not measured in sudden revolutions, but in centuries of patient steps. The slow spread of navigation tools is still unfolding, and it will continue for as long as humanity gazes at the horizon, lifts its eyes to the sky, and dares to cross the water. And so our story has gently come to its close. Before we drift into the next chapter, may I kindly ask you to leave a like and subscribe. It truly helps this quiet space continue. Now let us move together, calm and unhurried, into the next tale in our Boring History for Sleep series. How early lighthouses kept ships safe. Long before satellites tracked ships across oceans, long before radar scanned the horizon and digital screens lit up with precise charts, sailors faced the sea with little more than memory, instinct, and fragile tools. The sea, for all its generosity, has always been unforgiving. Rocks hid beneath the waves, currents pulled vessels from their course, and storms stripped away visibility, leaving ships adrift in darkness. In these conditions, a single light could mean the difference between disaster and safety. The story of lighthouses, those steadfast guardians along the shore, begins not with grand towers, but with simple fires. Ancient sailors, venturing farther from familiar coasts, needed markers to guide them home. Communities responded by building bonfires on cliffs, using flames as beacons visible from the water. These early lights were crude but effective, offering reassurance to those returning at night. The principle was timeless: to bring light into the darkness of the sea, to give sailors a fixed point of safety when the world around them was uncertain. Among the earliest and most famous of these lights was the Pharos of Alexandria, built in the 3rd century BCE on the small island of Pharos near the Egyptian coast. This towering structure, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood more than 100 meters tall. Day and night it guided ships into the busy port of Alexandria, its fire reflected by polished bronze mirrors to project a beam far into the sea. For centuries, it was the tallest man-made structure on Earth and became the model for lighthouses across the Mediterranean. Sailors who saw its glow knew that safety lay ahead, that harbor walls would soon replace the endless rhythm of waves. The Pharos was not alone. Ancient Greece and Rome built smaller versions, placing towers with fires at key harbors. In Ostia, the port of Rome, a lighthouse stood to welcome ships bringing grain from across the empire. On islands and promontories throughout the Aegean and Adriatic seas, beacons glowed in the night. Some were maintained by soldiers, others by local communities, for the value of a safe harbor was recognized by all. Yet these early lighthouses were few, expensive to build, and difficult to maintain. Fire required constant tending, wood or oil had to be supplied, and storms often damaged the towers. As a result, lighthouses spread slowly, appearing only in the most important ports where trade justified the cost. Most sailors still relied on stars, landmarks, and luck, knowing that only a handful of coasts offered the gift of a guiding light. The function of lighthouses was never only practical. They also carried symbolism. To a weary crew, seeing a flame on the horizon was like seeing civilization itself. It meant food, water, and rest after the uncertainty of the sea. Lighthouses became markers of trust, binding communities to sailors and sailors to land. They were promises, built of stone and fire, that the dangers of the sea could be met with human care. Over time, as empires expanded and trade networks grew, the need for more reliable signals increased. Different regions developed their own styles. In the eastern Mediterranean, towers often stood on rocky promontories, while in the west, fires were sometimes placed on platforms atop cliffs. The materials varied, stone, brick, or wood, but the principle remained constant. A light in darkness was safety, and safety was priceless. By the medieval period, after the fall of Rome, many ancient lighthouses fell into ruin. The Pharos of Alexandria itself, damaged by earthquakes, eventually collapsed. But the memory of these structures lingered, and the need for guidance never disappeared. Coastal communities revived the practice with simple watchfires, maintained by monks, soldiers, or townsfolk. In some places, monasteries on remote islands became guardians of sailors, their lights both spiritual and practical, serving the dual role of faith and navigation. The spread of early lighthouses remained slow, limited by cost and technology, yet each one was cherished. To a sailor rounding a dangerous cape, the flicker of fire on stone was a friend in the night. To those waiting ashore, it was a way of extending hospitality, of welcoming strangers and kin alike. And so, with every generation, the idea of the lighthouse endured, surviving the rise and fall of empires, adapting to new materials, and always carrying the same message: that even in the darkest night, light could be found, and that ships need never be alone on the water. As the medieval centuries unfolded, the story of lighthouses became one of both decline and revival. The collapse of the great empires meant that many of the monumental towers of antiquity, including the pharaohs of Alexandria, fell into ruin. Earthquakes toppled their stones, neglect dimmed their flames, and seafarers once again found themselves at the mercy of dark and uncertain coasts. Yet the need for guidance never disappeared, and in many places, communities kept the tradition alive with humbler means. Fires were lit on cliffs by fishermen, monasteries tended lamps in windows that faced the sea, and castles built along strategic headlands raised torches to warn or welcome ships. These were not the grand lighthouses of marble and mirrors, but they served the same purpose: to give sailors hope and direction when the night swallowed the horizon. In the Mediterranean, where trade and pilgrimage never ceased, such beacons were vital. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, merchants carrying spices, wine and grain, and navies patrolling contested waters, all depended on lights that marked safe passage. Some of these lights were little more than braziers set upon towers, while others were enclosed lanterns fed with oil. Their construction reflected the materials at hand and the wealth of the communities that built them. In Venice, for example, where maritime trade flourished, early lighthouse towers guided ships into the lagoons. In the Islamic world, ports along North Africa and the Levant maintained lamps that glowed through the night. Though their designs varied, their purpose was shared: to keep the sea from claiming lives unnecessarily. Over time, the revival of lighthouses grew more organized. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as maritime trade expanded, rulers and city-states began to recognize that secure harbors required reliable signals. New towers were constructed, some combining the functions of defense and navigation. Along the French and Italian coasts, fortified towers doubled as beacons, lit at night to guide ships and guard against raiders. In England, the Dover Cliffs eventually became home to lights that warned sailors approaching the treacherous channel. Yet these early medieval lighthouses faced constant challenges. Fuel had to be supplied, whether wood, coal, or oil, and keeping a fire burning through long nights required human vigilance. Storms often extinguished flames, and poor weather could obscure them. Unlike the later precision of optics and electricity, medieval lights were fragile, inconsistent, and limited in range. Still, to those at sea, even a faint glow is a lifeline, better than nothing in the vast darkness. The symbolism of lighthouses deepened in this era as well. To Christian pilgrims, a light in the distance carried spiritual meaning, echoing the idea of guidance and salvation. Monasteries that tended lamps on remote coasts became both literal and metaphorical guardians, their lights representing charity as much as practicality. To merchants, the glow of a harbor beacon meant safety for their goods and profits for their ventures. To rulers, it meant control of trade routes and prestige for their cities. Thus, the spread of lighthouses was not only a matter of survival, but also of identity and power. By the late medieval period, the first attempts to improve lighthouse technology appeared. Instead of open flames, enclosed lanterns with glass or horn panes were used to protect fires from the wind. Some towers experimented with parabolic reflectors made of polished metal, directing the flame's light farther out to sea. Though primitive compared to later optics, these were important steps forward. Yet, as always, adoption was slow. Many communities continued to rely on simple fires, for cost and practicality limited innovation. The slow spread of these early improvements reflected the broader rhythm of maritime history. Progress layered gently, generation by generation, never sweeping all at once. By the 15th century, with the growth of long-distance trade and the approach of the Age of Exploration, the importance of lighthouses grew again. ports that hoped to attract merchants invested in towers that could be seen farther out to sea. In the busy Mediterranean, where galleys, cogs, and caravels crowded the waters, the presence of a lighthouse marked a harbor as trustworthy and safe. For sailors who braved storms, pirates, and uncertain winds, the promise of a light was worth more than gold. It was proof that land awaited, that people cared enough to guide them home. And so, even as many coasts remained dark and treacherous, the spread of early lighthouses continued, step by step, carrying forward the timeless idea that in the vastness of the sea, even a single flame could mean survival. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the scattered practice of lighting fires along the coast began to take on a more deliberate form, as states and maritime republics recognized the strategic value of organized lighthouses. Trade in the Mediterranean and beyond was expanding rapidly, and with it came a greater demand for safety at sea. Merchants carrying spices from the east, wool and textiles from Europe, and precious metals from Africa all required secure harbors and reliable passage. The risks were immense, and so communities began investing in towers that could offer more than temporary flames on cliffs. One of the most significant aspects of this period was the establishment of formal systems of maintenance. Instead of local villagers or monks tending lights as acts of charity, governments and city authorities began to assign keepers whose sole duty was to ensure that the fire never went out. In places like Venice, Genoa, and Marseille, the job of lighthouse keeper became a recognized position, a role of both responsibility and honor. These individuals, often living in isolation for weeks or months at a time, ensured that flames or lanterns remained burning through the darkest nights. Their work was invisible to most, but to sailors on the horizon, it meant everything. The Renaissance also brought renewed interest in science and engineering, and with it came attempts to improve the design of lighthouses. Towers were constructed taller, allowing their light to reach farther. Stone and brick replaced weaker materials, ensuring that the structures could endure storms and time. In some places, experiments with mirrors and lenses began to appear, crude precursors of the optical systems that would later revolutionize lighthouse design. Polished metal plates reflected firelight outward, increasing visibility, though the range was still limited. Nevertheless, these innovations signaled a shift toward greater ambition, a recognition that technology could amplify the power of a flame. The symbolism of lighthouses in the Renaissance grew even more pronounced. They were not only guides for sailors, but also monuments of civic pride. Cities that controlled trade routes wanted to be known as safe havens, and a well-maintained lighthouse served as a public declaration of reliability. To approach a harbor and see a sturdy tower glowing through the mist was to feel trust in the community that had built it. Lighthouses became as much about reputation as about function. Yet the spread of these towers remained gradual. The cost of construction and maintenance was high, and only wealthy ports or states could afford them. Smaller towns still relied on simple fires, and many coastlines remained dark. The Mediterranean was a patchwork of safety and danger, some harbors marked by proud beacons, others by nothing more than treacherous rocks. This unevenness reflected the slow pace of change, for maritime history rarely moves in leaps, but in careful steps. Outside the Mediterranean, lighthouses also began to rise in northern Europe, particularly along the treacherous coasts of the Atlantic and the North Sea. These waters, with their storms and tides, demanded guidance, and the spread of lighthouses in these regions influenced Mediterranean builders in turn. Ideas traveled with sailors, and knowledge of construction and lighting methods circulated across Europe. Still, each lighthouse was unique, shaped by its environment, its community, and the resources available. The daily life of a lighthouse keeper in this period was a story of endurance. Tending a fire meant hauling wood, coal, or oil, often in harsh conditions. In remote locations, supplies had to be brought by boat, and storms could leave keepers isolated for weeks. Yet despite the difficulty, the role carried deep meaning. To know that one's work kept ships from wrecking, to know that sailors' lives depended on a steady flame, gave dignity to the task. The slow spread of lighthouses in the Renaissance also shows us how human determination bridged the gap between vulnerability and safety. The sea remained unpredictable, but the presence of even a few towers transformed navigation. Sailors began to include these lights in their mental maps, marking them as waypoints in their journeys. Gradually, the idea of a network of lighthouses took root, though it would take centuries more before such networks became common. By the close of the Renaissance, lighthouses were still rare, but they had become established symbols of safety, community, and progress. Each flame that glowed against the night carried forward an ancient promise that the sea, though vast and dangerous, could be met with human care. And in every harbor where a tower stood, sailors felt a reassurance that echoed through the centuries, the knowledge that they were not alone in the dark. By the 17th century, the slow expansion of lighthouses entered a new chapter, as maritime trade grew more global and the Mediterranean became increasingly busy with ships bound not only for its own ports, but also for distant oceans. The age of exploration had revealed new worlds and new routes, but the old seas still mattered, and the Mediterranean remained one of the most important crossroads of commerce. In this era, the role of lighthouses began to shift from being isolated symbols of safety to becoming part of more coordinated efforts at maritime infrastructure. States and empires recognized that controlling the sea required not only ships and navies, but also the tools to guide them home. Towers rose taller, their lights brighter, and their keepers more professional. The 17th century saw advances in optics that began to transform lighthouse technology. Experiments with glass lenses and parabolic mirrors allowed fires and oil lamps to be focused into beams rather than scattered glows. Though crude compared to modern standards, these early optical systems increased visibility and range, making lighthouses more useful than ever before. Once again, however, the spread of these innovations was slow. Wealthy ports and powerful states could afford to experiment with lenses and reflectors, while smaller communities still relied on open flames and braziers. The result was the same uneven pattern that had always defined maritime history. Progress layered gently, never sweeping all at once, with the old and the new existing side by side. The symbolism of lighthouses grew during this time as well. In addition to guiding ships, they became statements of authority. To build a lighthouse was to claim control of a coast, to declare to sailors that the harbor was secure, defended, and organized. For merchants, a lighthouse was a sign of trustworthiness, suggesting that the port was reliable and invested in maritime safety. For rulers, it was also a matter of prestige, a way to show the wealth and stability of their dominion. Yet behind the grandeur of towers stood the humble lives of keepers. These men, and sometimes families, lived in isolation, tending the flame through all weather. Their days were measured by the needs of the light, gathering fuel, cleaning soot from lamps, trimming wicks, and watching through the night. A storm could make their task dangerous, yet their responsibility never wavered. For ships at sea, their constancy meant survival. The work was lonely but essential, and in many places the role of keeper became hereditary, passed down through generations who saw themselves as guardians of the coast. In Northern Europe, particularly along the stormy Atlantic, lighthouses began to multiply in this era, and knowledge of improved construction spread southward to the Mediterranean. Tower designs incorporated stronger foundations, able to withstand waves and winds, and fires were replaced by oil lamps that burned longer and brighter. Each new advance, however, spread only as quickly as money, politics, and culture allowed. In the Mediterranean, where many voyages were coastal and familiar, communities sometimes resisted the expense of new towers, trusting to memory and tradition. Still, progress came, and slowly the shores became brighter. By the 18th century, the idea of a network of lighthouses was becoming more realistic. Maritime powers began to chart their coasts systematically, noting where lights should be placed to reduce danger. Navigation was still far from certain, but every new beacon extended the zone of safety. Every flame pushed back the boundaries of fear. For sailors entering the Mediterranean through Gibraltar, seeing the glow of a lighthouse after weeks on the Atlantic was a reassurance beyond words. For those sailing eastward toward Alexandria, the reappearance of towers along the Levantine coast was a promise that ancient traditions of guidance endured. What remained constant was the slow pace of change. Even as science advanced and empires grew, lighthouses spread carefully, one tower at a time, built by hands that understood both the sea's danger and its promise. The 17th and 18th centuries did not see the sudden illumination of all coasts, but they did mark the steady rise of lighthouses as indispensable parts of maritime life. The sea was still vast, still uncertain, but with each tower that rose, the darkness receded a little more. And so, the story of early lighthouses continued, step by patient step, carrying forward the ancient idea that light, however fragile, could keep ships safe against the endless night. As the 18th century unfolded, the story of lighthouses began to enter a more scientific and organized phase, though, as always, the progress spread slowly across coasts and generations. The expansion of trade routes, the growth of naval power, and the increase in long-distance voyages created a stronger demand for reliable lights. Maritime nations now began to view lighthouses not only as helpful beacons, but as essential infrastructure for commerce and defense. This meant more investment, more innovation, and eventually more coordination. Yet the process remained gradual, layered onto the foundations of earlier centuries, rather than replacing them outright. One of the most important advances of this era was the introduction of new fuels and lamp designs. Instead of simple wood fires or crude oil lamps, many lighthouses now used whale oil or colza oil, which burned longer and with a steadier flame. Some regions experimented with coal fires, whose red glow could be seen farther, though the smoke often obscured visibility. Each improvement extended the range of the light, allowing sailors to see beacons from greater distances, but the spread of these innovations was uneven. Wealthy nations with busy ports adopted them first, while poorer or smaller communities continued with older methods. This patchwork of technology reflected the same slow rhythm that had defined lighthouse history from the beginning. The 18th century also saw greater experimentation with optics. Parabolic reflectors, made of polished metal, became more common, focusing the flame into a more directed beam. Although primitive compared to the Fresnel lenses that would later revolutionize lighthouses in the 19th century, these reflectors represented a significant improvement, and their gradual adoption showed how science was beginning to shape maritime safety. Still, not every tower could afford such equipment, and many keepers continued to tend open flames. In practice, this meant that some harbors glowed brightly with modern lights, while others offered only faint and flickering signals, a reminder that safety at sea was never guaranteed. The organization of lighthouse networks also began to emerge in this period. Maritime powers such as Britain, France, and later the United States recognized that scattered individual towers were not enough. To truly protect shipping, a systematic approach was needed, with lights placed at intervals along coasts, each distinguished by its own pattern or color. In the Mediterranean, Venice, Marseille, and later Naples developed plans to ensure that ships entering their waters could find consistent guidance. Still, building and maintaining these towers required resources, and progress was slow. Even as some ports became reliably lit, many dangerous stretches of coast remained dark, waiting for future generations to bring light. The daily lives of lighthouse keepers in the 18th century remained difficult but increasingly professionalized. In many places, governments took responsibility for paying wages and supplying fuel, making the keeper's role more stable and recognized. Yet isolation was still profound. Keepers lived in stone towers, often with their families, surrounded by storms and waves, their world measured by the rhythm of tending lamps. They trimmed wicks, polished reflectors, cleaned soot, and carried fuel up endless stairs. Their work demanded constancy, for a single lapse could cost sailors their lives. The dignity of their task, however, was understood by sailors who relied on them, and many keepers became legendary figures in their communities, remembered for their dedication to the light. Symbolically, lighthouses grew even more powerful in this age. As trade expanded and nations sought to project influence, lighthouses became monuments of both safety and sovereignty. To see a bright beacon shining across the waves was not only to see a guide, but to see the presence of authority, the reach of a state extending into the sea. Travelers and sailors described lighthouses in their journals not just as useful structures, but as marvels, blending function with beauty. Reminders that human effort could challenge the vastness of nature. By the close of the 18th century, the stage was set for even greater transformations. The scientific advances of the Enlightenment were filtering slowly into lighthouse design, promising improvements that would change the very nature of coastal safety. Yet the pace remained steady, not sudden. Old methods lingered, new ones spread cautiously, and across the Mediterranean the story was still one of contrast. Some ports were brilliantly marked, others remained perilous, and all shared the eternal truth that the sea was vast and uncertain, and that a single light could still mean the difference between life and death. The 19th century marked a turning point in the history of lighthouses. Though true to tradition, progress came slowly and unevenly. The age of sail was giving way to the age of steam, and ships were growing larger, faster, and more numerous. With this growth came greater risks. Ports bustled with new traffic, and coastlines grew more crowded, increasing the demand for reliable guidance. Maritime nations realized that lighthouses could no longer be scattered conveniences, but had to become systematic networks, planned and maintained with care. One of the most revolutionary changes of the 19th century was the introduction of the Fresnel lens. Invented in France by Augustin Jean Fresnel in the 1820s, this lens used concentric rings of glass to capture and focus light into a powerful beam. A lighthouse equipped with a Fresnel lens could project its light many times farther than earlier lamps, with an intensity that cut through fog and darkness. The effect was transformative, and yet, as always, the spread was gradual. Wealthy nations quickly adopted the new lenses for major towers, while smaller or poorer ports continued with older reflectors or even open flames. Over the course of decades, however, the Fresnel lens became the standard, turning lighthouses into beacons visible for dozens of miles at sea. The 19th century also brought new fuels and lamps. Whale oil was gradually replaced by colza oil, then by kerosene, each providing brighter and more efficient flames. Later, gas lighting was introduced in some towers, followed eventually by electricity, though that spread took time. Each advance promised reliability and range, but none erased the need for constant human care. Lighthouse keepers still climbed stairs with heavy fuel cans, trimmed wicks, and cleaned soot from glass, their lives shaped by the rhythm of the flame. Their work remained lonely, demanding, and crucial, and in this century it began to receive greater recognition. Governments increasingly formalized the profession, creating lighthouse services that oversaw staffing, supplies, and maintenance. The Mediterranean in this era became dotted with towers that reflected both local tradition and new global science. Along the coasts of France, Italy, Greece, and North Africa, old watchtowers were rebuilt or modernized with Fresnel lenses, while new towers rose on promontories and islands. The Strait of Gibraltar, long a critical passage, gained improved lights to guide the heavy flow of international trade. Ports like Alexandria, Marseille, and Naples invested heavily, ensuring that their harbors were marked by strong, reliable beams. Yet at the same time, countless smaller coasts remained dark or faintly lit, for resources were limited, and the sea's vastness could never be illuminated all at once. Life as a lighthouse keeper in the 19th century took on new rhythms. The introduction of more advanced optics required specialized training, and many keepers became skilled technicians as well as watchmen. They learned to polish delicate glass lenses, to adjust mechanisms that rotated lights, and to maintain the intricate machinery that allowed a lighthouse to shine steadily through the night. Rotating lights also created distinctive flashing patterns, known as characteristics, which allowed sailors to distinguish one lighthouse from another. This innovation transformed navigation, for ships could now identify not only that a light was present, but which light it was, and therefore where they were. Still, the spread of such systems took decades, and sailors continued to rely on memory, charts, and caution even as the technology improved. Symbolically, lighthouses in this century became icons of the industrial age. Their tall stone or cast iron towers, fitted with gleaming lenses and often painted in bold patterns, were monuments of progress and reassurance. To sailors, they were still guardians of safety, but to the public, they also came to represent human triumph over nature, proof that science and engineering could tame even the darkest night. Yet for all the pride and symbolism, the essence of the lighthouse remained unchanged. It was still a flame, whether oil, gas, or electric, kept alive by human hands, shining across the water to guide ships home. And its spread, though faster than in previous centuries, still followed the same steady rhythm, from the busiest ports outward, from the wealthiest nations to others, step by step, generation by generation. By the close of the 19th century, the Mediterranean was brighter than it had ever been. Towers stood on cliffs and islands, their beams sweeping across the sea, forming a loose network of guidance. Still, gaps remained, and countless dangers persisted. But compared to the scattered fires of antiquity, the progress was remarkable. The story of lighthouses had entered a modern age, yet it continued to unfold with the same patience that had always defined it. As the 19th century unfolded into its later decades, the spread of lighthouses and their technologies became more closely tied to the expansion of global trade and empire. Wherever ships carried goods, armies, or migrants, governments and maritime authorities felt pressure to extend chains of light along coasts and across colonies. Yet, in keeping with the slow rhythm of lighthouse history, these advances were always partial, never absolute. New towers might rise in one region while another remained unlit for years, a reminder that progress at sea has always been uneven. Britain, with its vast colonial network, invested heavily in lighthouses not only on its home shores, but also across key routes to India, Africa, and the Far East. Towering lights were constructed at Gibraltar, Malta, and Cyprus, all meant to guide ships into or through the Mediterranean. The French likewise built modern stations along North Africa, ensuring that Algeria and Tunisia had safe approaches for European ships. Each new tower represented an intersection of engineering, politics, and commerce, but also carried forward the ancient mission to save lives and protect vessels from destruction. The design of lighthouses themselves evolved with materials of the industrial era. Traditional stone and brick gave way in many places to cast iron, which allowed for faster construction and taller, slimmer towers that could be erected even on remote rocky outcrops. Iron towers could be prefabricated, shipped in pieces, and assembled on site, a significant advantage in colonies or isolated coasts. Their stark forms, often painted with striking stripes or bands, became distinctive silhouettes against sky and sea. Yet these towers were not universally loved. Some mariners found their thin shapes less reassuring than the massive stone bastions of earlier centuries. Still, practicality ensured their spread, and cast iron lighthouses became icons of the later 19th century. Despite mechanical improvements, the human element remained central. Keepers still lived in isolation, often with their families, enduring monotonous routines punctuated by storms, breakdowns, or passing ships. The introduction of rotating machinery, clockwork gears, and weights to turn lenses required constant winding and maintenance. In many stations, 2 or 3 keepers worked in shifts to ensure that the light never faltered. Their diaries reveal days filled with tasks of cleaning, polishing, repairing, and recording weather. It was a life of duty, respected but seldom envied, where one's reward was the knowledge that unseen sailors survived because a flame had been tended through the night. The development of distinctive light signatures deserves special attention, for it marked one of the most practical innovations of this era. Mariners, armed with charts that listed the timing of flashes, could distinguish one lighthouse from another with remarkable precision. A light that flashed every 10 seconds, or 3 times in succession, became as unique as a name. This system reduced confusion, especially in crowded waters like the English Channel or the Adriatic Sea, where multiple beams might otherwise blur together. In the Mediterranean, ports like Trieste, Genoa, and Barcelona each established their own light characteristics, weaving them into a growing language of signals that made the sea more legible. The symbolic role of lighthouses deepened during this century as well. They were no longer only practical aids. They became emblems of national pride and technological modernity. To build a great lighthouse was to demonstrate mastery of science and maritime power. Tourists sometimes visited them, marveling at the great lenses and the dizzying views from the lantern galleries. Writers and painters found in them a poetic mixture of solitude and guidance, often likening them to guardians standing between humanity and the abyss. Yet, behind the symbolism, the daily function remained stubbornly unchanged. A steady light, patiently maintained, offering direction to those who sailed in darkness. By the century's end, electricity began to appear in select towers, though at first it was limited by cost and infrastructure. Electric lamps provided dazzling beams, far brighter than oil or kerosene, and promised eventual automation. But the transition would take decades, with many towers remaining reliant on traditional fuels well into the 20th century. Thus, even as science surged ahead, the familiar figure of the keeper with his oil can and lantern persisted, bridging old and new. Looking back, the 19th century may appear as a period of rapid transformation, but in the measured world of lighthouses, it was still a long process of adaptation, step by step. From France to Britain, from Italy to the Ottoman Empire, Lighthouses multiplied but never eliminated danger. They grew stronger but never replaced seamanship. Their beams carried farther but still vanished in fog. And always they were grounded in the devotion of men and women who lived at the edge of sea and land, ensuring that light endured through the night. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century slowly unfolded, lighthouses entered another transitional period, one where technology continued to evolve, yet the familiar routines of older methods remained firmly in place. The world's oceans were busier than ever, filled with steamships, cargo vessels, and passenger liners that stitched continents together more tightly than in any previous age. With this increase in maritime traffic came renewed pressure to improve navigational safety, and lighthouses remained the most visible and dependable guardians of the sea. At the dawn of this era, kerosene lamps had largely replaced earlier oils, providing brighter and steadier flames that could endure strong winds within their protective lantern glass. The Fresnel lens, perfected in size and variety, had become a global standard, appearing in towers across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and even remote Pacific islands. Mariners of the period often remarked on the comfort they felt upon recognizing the steady rhythm of a particular light after long days of uncertain weather. That familiarity turned individual towers into landmarks not only of geography, but also of reassurance, each with its own character, its own reputation, and in some cases even its own folklore among sailors. It was during this period that lighthouses began to be grouped into networks more consciously than before. Nations organized their coasts into systematic chains, each light carefully positioned so that a ship passing along the shore would always see one or more, guiding beacons. In France, the Service des Phares coordinated this expansion, while in Britain the Trinity House continued its centuries-old responsibility of managing lights and buoys. Across the Atlantic, the United States Lighthouse Board oversaw a program that spread lighthouses across both Atlantic and Pacific coasts, the Great Lakes, and even territories like Hawaii and Puerto Rico. These organizations introduced not only engineering expertise, but also bureaucratic oversight, ensuring that lighthouses operated with a consistency suited to a new age of international shipping. The lives of keepers in this period reveal both continuity and change. Many stations still required long periods of isolation, with families growing up in the shadow of towers that were their only world. Children played near rocky shores or within the narrow confines of small islands, their earliest memories shaped by the rhythm of the lantern and the sound of waves. Yet at the same time, new technologies began to alter the keeper's responsibilities. The installation of telephone lines and later radio links allowed for quicker communication with the mainland. Mechanized rotation systems reduced the physical strain of winding heavy weights every few hours. In some larger stations, kerosene was eventually supplemented or replaced by early electric systems, though these remained rare until after the First World War. Even with such innovations, the discipline of constant attention did not diminish. Storms could extinguish lamps, machinery could jam, and lenses could crack under sudden changes of temperature. In every case, human vigilance remained the decisive factor. Lighthouses of the late 19th and early 20th centuries also took on an increasingly architectural character. Some nations saw them not merely as functional tools, but as monuments of national identity. In Scotland, towers designed by members of the Stevenson family, ancestors of the novelist Robert Louis Stevenson, combined elegance with resilience, and their engineering genius left a lasting mark across the British Isles. In America, the towering structures of Cape Hatteras, or Split Rock, became symbols of local pride as much as navigational aids. Architects experimented with different shapes, from cylindrical towers to octagonal and square profiles, each reflecting both aesthetic choices and practical concerns of stability. The symbolism of lighthouses deepened further as they became cultural metaphors. Writers used them as images of constancy, spiritual guidance, and the thin line between safety and peril. Poets described them as solitary guardians, while novelists sometimes used them as settings for tales of isolation and endurance. The general public, increasingly able to travel, visited lighthouses as destinations in themselves, climbing spiral staircases to see lantern rooms that had once been closed to all but keepers. Thus, lighthouses became part of the cultural landscape in ways that reached far beyond their immediate maritime purpose. Yet, for all these cultural associations, the practical reality remained one of endless maintenance and watchfulness. Keepers spent countless hours cleaning soot from lenses, polishing brass fittings, repairing leaks in lantern housings, and recording weather in meticulous logs. Their work was rarely glamorous, but its necessity was beyond dispute. Each small action contributed to the survival of ships carrying goods, passengers, and sailors across dangerous waters. Without their discipline, the entire network of lights would collapse into darkness, leaving the seas once more to chance and misfortune. By the early 20th century, as steam gave way to steel-hulled vessels and global wars loomed on the horizon, the lighthouse stood as both a relic of older times and a crucial tool of modern industry. It was slow to change compared to other technologies, yet its very slowness contributed to its reliability. Mariners knew that no matter how modern their engines or how vast their cargoes, they would still look to the coast for the steady rhythm of a light that had been tended with patience. And so the story of lighthouses in this transitional age is one of balance, between tradition and innovation, between solitude and connection, between the unchanging duty of light and the restless movement of ships that depended on it. As the 20th century unfolded and global events reshaped the map of nations, lighthouses continued to stand at the edges of seas and lakes, quiet but indispensable. The First World War marked the beginning of a new era in which these structures were tested not only by storms, but by human conflict. Coastal defenses became a priority, and many lighthouses found themselves suddenly militarized. Towers that had for centuries symbolized safety and guidance were repurposed as watchtowers, signaling posts or even artillery targets. Some lights were deliberately extinguished to confuse enemy vessels, a reversal of their most basic mission. Others were camouflaged or guarded by soldiers who shared the same windswept loneliness that lighthouse keepers had long endured. During the war years, keepers were expected to remain vigilant not only against the sea, but against hostile ships or submarines. This dual responsibility made their work heavier, but also gave it a renewed sense of national duty. After the war ended, lighthouses resumed their peacetime role, but the experience left a mark, reminding all who depended on them that even the light of safety could be caught up in the uncertainties of human affairs. The interwar years brought a slow but steady expansion of electrification. Where once kerosene lamps flickered, electric bulbs began to glow with greater brightness and stability. This change required new equipment, from generators to wiring systems, and in many cases demanded new training for keepers who had grown used to wicks, oil, and clockwork mechanisms. The introduction of electricity also allowed for more powerful beams that could reach farther into the sea. Ships now navigating at higher speeds and greater tonnage relied on these stronger signals, which gave them more time to adjust course in dangerous waters. At the same time, experiments in radio navigation and the first primitive radar systems hinted that a future of electronic guidance might eventually diminish the role of lighthouses. Yet in this transitional stage, the two worlds existed side by side. A sailor in the 1920s or 1930s might consult both a wireless signal and the familiar flash of a coastal light, finding reassurance in the combination of old and new. Life for lighthouse keepers in this period reflected a similar blend. The isolation remained, especially for stations far from shore, but some duties shifted as machinery replaced manual labor. Instead of trimming wicks through the night, keepers monitored voltmeters and generators, ensuring that the electrical systems did not fail. The rhythm of winding heavy weights gave way to the hum of engines, though the sense of responsibility never lessened. Visitors to lighthouses often remarked on the strange mixture of modern wires and ancient stone walls, as though 2 centuries had collapsed into a single moment. This impression of timelessness became one of the enduring features of lighthouse culture. The Second World War once again brought profound disruption. Lighthouses across Europe and Asia became strategic assets, coveted or targeted by both sides. In the Atlantic, German submarines prowled coastal waters, and Allied navies relied heavily on lighthouses for orientation. Some towers were destroyed by bombing, their stones scattered across the rocks they had once guarded. Others were rebuilt even during the conflict, testimony to their indispensable role. Keepers during these years faced dangers beyond the sea: the risk of shellfire, the fear of invasion, the constant uncertainty of war. Yet many accounts describe how they continued their routines as best they could, lighting lamps, maintaining lenses, and writing logs even as the world collapsed into violence around them. After 1945, as peace slowly returned, lighthouses entered another stage of modernization. Governments invested in reconstruction, building new towers where old ones had fallen, and updating others with improved optics and stronger electrical systems. Advances in maritime law also emphasized the need for standardized signals across international waters, and lighthouses became part of coordinated global networks. Their light patterns, once designed independently, were now harmonized to prevent confusion, ensuring that a sailor in Asia, Europe, or the Americas could interpret flashes with the same clarity. Despite these advances, the cultural image of the lighthouse as solitary and romantic deepened in the public imagination. Writers, artists, and filmmakers used lighthouses as symbols of endurance, mystery, or nostalgia. Tourists increasingly sought them out, not just as functional tools, but as places to visit, photograph, and admire. Some lighthouses even opened small museums or gift shops, reflecting their growing place in heritage tourism. Yet beneath this surface of public fascination, the daily labor of keeping the light remained as demanding as ever. Keepers cleaned salt off glass, painted walls against rust, and carried supplies up endless flights of stairs. Their diaries speak of loneliness mixed with pride, of the satisfaction of watching ships pass safely by, and of the quiet knowledge that few beyond the sea ever thought of their efforts. By the mid-20th century, as radar became standard on ships and electronic navigation grew more sophisticated, many observers predicted that lighthouses would soon become obsolete. Yet history proved otherwise. Mariners continued to value the human presence of a steady beam, especially in moments when machines failed or storms disrupted signals. The lighthouse, far from vanishing, adapted once more, finding relevance even as the technological landscape shifted beneath it. And so, by the time the century reached its middle decades, the lighthouse stood as a paradox, an ancient invention that had survived into the modern world, not by resisting change, but by absorbing it, holding fast to its essential mission of safety while adjusting to the realities of new eras. By the latter half of the 20th century, lighthouses found themselves standing between tradition and transformation. Automated systems began to spread rapidly, first as simple mechanisms that allowed lamps to switch on and off without human touch, and later as sophisticated programs that could monitor weather, adjust intensity, and even transmit signals directly to passing ships. For governments, automation offered the promise of lower costs and reduced need for permanent staff. For the keepers, however, it meant that centuries of human presence might slowly vanish from these towers. The romantic image of the solitary figure tending the flame at midnight gave way to control panels in distant offices. Some countries began decommissioning their lighthouse staff entirely, leaving behind only occasional visits by maintenance crews. The silence within those stone walls grew heavier, for where once voices echoed and footsteps rang on spiral staircases, now only the hum of machinery remained. Yet despite the reduction of human keepers, the lights themselves did not lose their purpose. Mariners still looked for them in darkness, and travelers still photographed them against sunsets. Indeed, lighthouses took on a new role in cultural memory. Communities fought to preserve them as heritage landmarks, and local organizations organized fundraising drives to restore crumbling towers. In the United States, nonprofit groups adopted many decommissioned lighthouses, turning them into museums, bed and breakfast inns, or educational centers. In Europe, historical societies ensured that iconic structures like the Phare de Cordouan in France or the Hook Lighthouse in Ireland received protection as monuments of international significance. Tourists climbed their staircases not only to admire the view, but also to imagine the lives once lived within. At the same time, technology advanced further. Satellites, GPS, and digital mapping transformed navigation, making it possible for ships to pinpoint their location with astonishing precision. Some argued that with these tools, the age of the lighthouse had finally ended. But accidents at sea, whether from power failures, storms, or human error, reminded everyone that physical markers still mattered. A beam of light cutting through fog or darkness remained a reassuring constant when electronic systems faltered. In this way, lighthouses survived not as relics, but as backups, guardians that required no satellites to orbit overhead or batteries to recharge. Their reliability lay in their simplicity. A lamp and a lens, elevated high above the waves, could still speak across miles of ocean with perfect clarity. The 21st century has continued this paradoxical story of decline and resilience. Many lighthouses have been fully automated, their keepers gone, their staircases dusty. Yet at the same time, a cultural revival has kept their memory alive. Photographers post images of them online, writers describe their solitude in poetry and novels, and filmmakers use them as symbols of mystery, hope, or endurance. Communities near the coast often consider them civic treasures, sources of local pride that connect present generations with the struggles of the past. Some modern lighthouses have even been fitted with solar panels and advanced LED bulbs, blending ecological efficiency with ancient purpose. Their lights, though cheaper and greener to operate, still perform the same function as the fires lit by ancient mariners thousands of years ago. Looking back across the centuries, the story of lighthouses is one of persistence. From the wooden watchtowers of early civilizations to the mighty stone pharaohs of antiquity, from medieval beacons fueled by pitch to the elegant glass lenses of the industrial age, from hand-cranked lamps to automated systems controlled by satellites, the core mission has remained unchanged: to keep ships safe. Each generation has found its own way of sustaining that mission, adding layers of invention without discarding the essence. For sailors, the sight of a lighthouse beam still triggers an instinctive sense of safety. It is a sign that land is near, that dangers are marked, that someone or something has prepared a guide. Even for those who never sail, lighthouses symbolize steadfastness. They stand firm against storms, offering a reminder that constancy can survive, even in the face of relentless change. As you imagine these towers, think of the lonely cliffs where they rise, the winds that howl around their lantern rooms, and the endless patience with which they continue to shine. They ask for nothing in return, yet give everything they have: light, direction, and reassurance. And so, in the quiet hours of night, when the sea is restless and the sky is dark, a lighthouse remains what it has always been: a simple flame against the vast uncertainty, a guide through danger, a companion to all who journey across the waters. The story of how early lighthouses kept ships safe is, in truth, the story of how humanity itself has navigated the tension between fear and hope, darkness and light, danger and safety. The towers may change, the technology may evolve, but the need for guidance endures. As long as ships sail, as long as people cross oceans, the beams of lighthouses will still sweep across horizons, marking the line between peril and passage, between despair and return. In this way, the legacy of the lighthouse is not simply about navigation. It is about the human spirit's refusal to surrender to darkness. And that brings us to the end of this story. Before we begin the next one, may I kindly ask you for a like and a subscription to support this channel. Your support means a lot. And now, let us continue with another tale in our series of boring history for sleep, as we turn to the forgotten scripts that no one can read. The story of human civilization is not just carved into stone monuments or remembered in oral traditions. It is also inscribed in scripts, alphabets, and written forms that were designed to preserve thought, knowledge, and memory across generations. Yet within this grand archive of writing, there exists a curious silence. Entire scripts that no one today can read, forgotten systems of symbols that once carried meaning but now stand mute on tablets, walls, and scrolls. To study them is to gaze at a language without a voice, a message without a messenger, a puzzle without its final solution. When we think of writing, we might picture the hieroglyphs of Egypt, the cuneiform wedges of Mesopotamia, or the graceful characters of Chinese calligraphy. But those are the scripts that scholars eventually unlocked. The forgotten scripts are different. They remain sealed doors, and their very existence is a reminder of how fragile the chain of cultural transmission can be. One of the most famous examples is the Indus Valley script, etched into small seals and pottery fragments from a civilization that flourished thousands of years ago along the Indus River in what is now Pakistan and India. The script consists of short sequences of abstract symbols, sometimes accompanied by animals or human figures. And though scholars have speculated for over a century, no one has been able to agree on how to read them. Some argue it represents a full written language, while others suggest it might have been a set of religious or administrative symbols more mnemonic than phonetic. Without a bilingual text, like the Rosetta Stone was for Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Indus script resists every attempt at interpretation. And so each symbol carved into those ancient seals remains a silent witness to a civilization's lost voice. Another case that continues to baffle researchers is the Rongorongo script of Easter Island. Carved into wooden tablets by the Rapa Nui people, these glyphs feature stylized human and animal figures arranged in alternating directions. When the first Europeans encountered them in the 19th century, the knowledge of how to read them had already vanished, possibly lost after cultural upheaval, disease, and colonial disruption. Today, only a few dozen tablets survive, scattered across museums, and while many scholars have tried to decipher them, the meaning remains elusive. Were they genealogies, chants, or records of history? No one can say for certain, and the script stands as one of the most poignant examples of how quickly knowledge can vanish when oral transmission breaks. The mystery extends to other parts of the world as well. In Central America, for instance, alongside the Maya glyphs that scholars successfully deciphered, there exist other pre-Columbian scripts that remain undeciphered, possibly belonging to cultures that were overshadowed by larger empires or lost before they could be properly recorded. Similarly, in the Mediterranean, the enigmatic Linear A script from Minoan Crete has been studied for decades. While its descendant, Linear B, was deciphered and linked to early Greek, Linear A remains out of reach, a complex web of signs whose underlying language is unknown. Archaeologists can read the symbols, copy them faithfully, and even analyze their frequency, but without knowing the spoken tongue they represent, the true message cannot be recovered. What unites all of these cases is the sense of both presence and absence. The scripts exist physically, etched into materials that endure the passage of time, and yet their voices are absent because the knowledge of how to read them died with the communities that once kept them alive. Each undeciphered script carries with it the faint outline of a culture's memory, reminding us of how much we do not know about human history. For the historian or linguist, they are tantalizing challenges, suggesting hidden histories locked behind symbols that no longer open. For the rest of us, they are almost dreamlike, silent relics whose very silence encourages a sense of calm and reflection. To imagine entire civilizations communicating with each other in codes that are now completely sealed is to confront the vastness of time, the inevitability of forgetting, and the fragility of knowledge itself. And so as we lie back and let the thought drift through us, we can picture those ancient seals, tablets, and carvings, each marked with patterns that once carried life and meaning, now like whispers on stone, waiting endlessly to be heard again. When we consider the forgotten scripts of the world, one of the most intriguing aspects is not simply their existence, but the stubborn persistence of their silence. Scholars have dedicated entire careers to the study of these scripts, cataloging every symbol, counting their repetitions, testing patterns against known languages, and yet progress remains elusive. The Indus Valley script, for instance, has yielded thousands of examples across seals, pottery shards, and amulets, but almost all of them are incredibly short, often no more than 5 or 6 characters long. Imagine trying to reconstruct the grammar of a language if every surviving sentence was just a few words long and with no translation to guide you. That is the exact challenge researchers face, and it is why debates over the Indus script continue even today. Some claim it represents a Proto-Dravidian language, the ancestor of Tamil and other southern Indian tongues, while others argue it may have been more symbolic than linguistic, functioning like a system of emblems or heraldry. Every possibility remains open because the evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. The case of Linear A from ancient Crete is similarly frustrating. Discovered among the ruins of the Minoan civilization, Linear A appears on clay tablets and other artifacts, often related to accounting, inventories, or ceremonial uses. Its successor, Linear B, was famously deciphered in the mid-20th century and revealed itself as an early form of Greek, but Linear A stubbornly refuses to yield the same clarity. Part of the difficulty lies in the fact that while the signs of Linear A can be read phonetically using the values known from Linear B, the resulting words do not correspond to Greek or to any known language. This suggests that Linear A was used to write a tongue that has completely vanished, leaving no relatives or descendants to provide clues. Scholars can recognize repeated terms, probably names of places or goods, but beyond that, the text remains opaque, and with each passing decade, the silence deepens. Across the Pacific, the Rongorongo tablets of Easter Island carry their own haunting mystery. Unlike the Indus or Linear A, Rongorongo features longer texts, some with hundreds of glyphs carved in neat rows. They are read in a unique fashion, where the reader must rotate the tablet at the end of each line and continue in the opposite direction, almost like weaving words back and forth. This unusual method of writing shows the creativity of the Rapa Nui people, but the meaning has vanished, and without the oral tradition that once accompanied it, the glyphs remain mute. There are hints that they may have preserved genealogies or chants connected to rituals, but no one can be certain. The tragedy is heightened by the fact that when European explorers recorded the existence of the script in the 18th and 19th centuries, the island's population was already suffering from disease, slavery raids, and cultural collapse, leaving no one able to teach the system to outsiders. Thus, within a single generation, the last keepers of the knowledge were lost, and what might have been one of the most fascinating records of a Polynesian society became a locked code forever waiting to be understood. Another enigmatic script worth noting is the Cypro-Minoan writing of ancient Cyprus. Appearing around the 2nd millennium BCE, this script has been found on clay tablets and other artifacts, and though it bears a resemblance to Linear A, it remains undeciphered. The number of surviving inscriptions is small, and this scarcity makes analysis nearly impossible. Similarly, the Phaistos disc, a small clay object from Crete stamped with unique symbols arranged in a spiral, has long puzzled archaeologists. Its symbols do not match any known script, and because only one example has ever been found, scholars cannot compare it with other texts to find patterns. It remains one of the most enigmatic objects of archaeology, and many suspect it was ceremonial rather than practical, further complicating any attempt at decipherment. What all these cases reveal is that writing is not eternal, nor is it immune to loss. The scripts we cannot read today are the survivors of cultural systems that collapsed, leaving behind their traces without the living memory needed to interpret them. Each unreadable tablet or inscription is like a sealed book whose key was thrown away centuries ago. For us, they invite humility, for they remind us that our own systems of knowledge could also vanish if disconnected from living traditions. Imagine a world thousands of years from now in which digital data is unreadable because the devices and codes required to access it are forgotten. In that sense, the forgotten scripts of the past are not just mysteries, but warnings about the fragility of memory. And yet, there is also a quiet beauty in their silence, for they allow us to dream and to imagine what stories, prayers, or records might be hidden within those lines and curves. They are puzzles that may never be solved, and in their resistance to interpretation, they create a kind of stillness that perfectly suits the slow rhythm of reflection. The fascination with forgotten scripts lies not only in the symbols themselves, but also in the endless human effort to give them voice again. For centuries, people have stared at rows of characters carved into stone, pressed into clay, or written on fragments of bark, and they have asked the same question: what did this mean to the people who wrote it? To understand the challenges, one must consider how decipherment usually works. When scholars cracked the code of Egyptian hieroglyphs, it was because of the Rosetta Stone, which provided the same text in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek. By comparing a known language to the mysterious one, they slowly unlocked the phonetic values of the symbols. Likewise, Linear B was deciphered only because enough tablets survived, and scholars could recognize patterns that eventually revealed themselves to be an early form of Greek. Without a bilingual key or a large enough body of text, a script remains in the shadows, and this is precisely the fate of the Indus script, Linear A, Rongorongo, and many others. Each attempt to solve them becomes an exercise in patience, and more often than not, it ends in frustration. Some experts argue that the Indus script may not be a writing system in the strict sense at all. They point out the short length of inscriptions and suggest that the symbols may have functioned more like marks of identity or ownership, similar to brands on cattle or emblems on pottery. If true, this would mean that the Indus civilization, despite its vast cities and sophisticated urban planning, left behind no true writing, only symbolic notations. Others, however, believe that the brevity of the inscriptions does not rule out language, and that the script might have been used in ways that simply have not survived in the archaeological record. Perhaps longer texts were written on perishable materials like palm leaves, which decayed long ago, leaving only the short, durable examples on stone and metal. This tension between interpretation and silence captures the essence of why forgotten scripts exert such a pull on the imagination. Linear A provides another illustration of this mystery. Because its symbols overlap with Linear B, we can sound them out, but when we do, the words make no sense in Greek or any related language. It is as though we can hear the voice of the Minoans, but cannot understand what they are saying. The words flow like a melody from an unfamiliar tongue, one whose speakers vanished long before any written record of their vocabulary survived. This situation raises profound questions about the fragility of languages themselves. How many tongues have been spoken and then lost, leaving behind nothing but undecipherable echoes? The case of Rongorongo emphasizes another dimension of loss, the collapse of oral tradition. If even a single generation on Easter Island had been able to teach the meaning of the glyphs to their children, we might still possess the ability to read them. But once the knowledge chain was broken, the characters became silent wood carvings, beautiful yet mute. This is not unique to Easter Island. In cultures across the world, scripts often depended not only on physical symbols, but also on the living tradition of interpretation. Once that tradition was severed, meaning dissolved, no matter how carefully the symbols were carved or painted. Consider also the case of the Phaistos disc. Because only one copy exists, scholars cannot test hypotheses by comparing different examples. Each proposed solution, whether claiming the disc is a hymn, a list, or even a game, remains speculative, unsupported by additional evidence. The disc shows how chance survival shapes our understanding. If just one more disc were unearthed, the entire field might change, but until then, the symbols remain as mysterious as when they were discovered. These puzzles remind us that decipherment is not a guarantee. Without context, without comparison, without continuity, even the most brilliant minds cannot impose meaning where none survives. And yet, the mystery itself has value. Forgotten scripts reveal how much of human history is still beyond our grasp. They humble us, reminding us that we are not omniscient, that much of the past remains a silent expanse of questions. At the same time, they inspire, because each undeciphered script is also a possibility. Perhaps one day, in some forgotten storeroom or buried under the earth, another artifact will appear, providing the missing link. Until then, the unknown symbols remain as quiet companions to our nights of wondering, their silence echoing like a lullaby from civilizations long gone. When we reflect on the forgotten scripts of the world, it is important to understand the wider context in which they were created. Writing is not merely a tool for communication, it is also a reflection of society's priorities and the fragility of its memory. Some civilizations carved messages on stone, leaving inscriptions that could endure thousands of years, while others relied on more delicate materials such as palm leaves, parchment, or wood. These materials often perished with time, fire, or climate, taking with them entire worlds of thought that may never return. What survives for us to puzzle over today is often only a fragment, a tiny glimpse into a culture that was once vibrant, complex, and filled with voices. This fragility is what makes forgotten scripts so poignant. They are reminders not only of what we know, but of what we have lost. The absence of a key or a bilingual inscription means that we are left looking at symbols without sound, form without meaning, and messages without clarity. The scholars who dedicate their lives to studying these undeciphered texts often compare the process to standing at the edge of a vast ocean, seeing the waves but never being able to cross. The discipline demands patience, humility, and an acceptance that solutions may never come. Yet the pursuit itself carries meaning, for every attempt brings us closer to understanding how human expression takes shape across time. In the case of the Indus script, for example, the brevity of the text has left scholars divided. Some argue they represent names of merchants or deities, others that they are administrative marks or ritual signs. No consensus has emerged, but even these competing theories illuminate aspects of Indus life. They suggest trade networks, religious practices, and systems of social organization, even if we cannot translate the words themselves. With Linear A, the tantalizing overlap with Linear B shows us how cultures are interconnected. The Minoans influenced the Mycenaeans, and though the language of Linear A resists us, The very existence of the script shows us that Crete was once home to a literate society, capable of keeping records, performing rituals, and transmitting ideas through writing. Even in silence, Linear A speaks of the richness of the Minoan world. Rongorongo, by contrast, highlights the devastating impact of colonization on cultural memory. The knowledge of the script did not simply fade over centuries. It was violently interrupted. With the collapse of population and the imposition of foreign rule, traditions that might have preserved the key to the glyphs were cut short. In this sense, the unreadable lines carved into wooden tablets are not just a linguistic puzzle, but also a testimony to historical trauma. They whisper not only of what has been lost, but of the fragility of human heritage when confronted with outside force. The Phaistos disc adds another dimension, the element of chance. That a single clay disc, pressed with spiral symbols, has survived to our time is remarkable. But because there is only one, its meaning may remain closed to us forever. It is a reminder that history often leaves us with partial stories, fragments that stir our imagination but resist our logic. The disc is like a riddle with no answer, forcing us to acknowledge the limits of our understanding. And yet, there is comfort in this as well. These undeciphered scripts allow us to live with mystery. They remind us that not all questions must be answered, not all puzzles solved. In a world driven by instant access to information, the forgotten scripts are islands of wonder, teaching us patience and humility. They tell us that knowledge is not only about possession, but about appreciation, and that silence can carry meaning just as sound does. To listen to what we cannot understand is to recognize the vastness of human history, and to feel, in a small way, connected to the unknown lives that came before us. In the stillness of night, when one imagines the faint glow of lanterns and scholars bent over faded symbols, the forgotten scripts take on a dreamlike quality. They become stories without endings, voices without words, and songs without notes. And perhaps that is why they fit so well into the quiet rhythm of reflection before sleep. For they are not meant to excite us with answers, but to soothe us with the awareness of timeless mystery, reminding us that history is not a straight path of knowledge gained, but also a gentle landscape of questions that remain, waiting quietly in the dark. As we move further into the exploration of forgotten scripts, it becomes clear that their power lies not only in what they once meant to the people who wrote them, but also in the emotions they stir within us today. Each undeciphered symbol is a silent messenger from another age, a fragment of communication that has outlived its speakers, its readers, and perhaps even the entire civilization that once relied upon it. To look at such scripts is to feel the humbling presence of time itself. The shapes carved into clay, scratched onto stone, or pressed into wooden tablets are like faint footprints left in shifting sand, fragile and impermanent, yet preserved by accident long enough to challenge our imagination. There is something deeply human about the effort to write. To inscribe words is to try to make a thought last beyond the fleeting moment, to give permanence to memory, law, faith, or trade. When those inscriptions lose their meaning, when the key to them vanishes, what remains is an enduring mystery. This is why undeciphered scripts capture so much fascination. They are like locked doors with no keys, waiting silently while generations of scholars, adventurers, and dreamers knock upon them, hoping for an answer that may never come. Consider again the case of Rongorongo. To some, its glyphs appear as dancing figures or flowing patterns, yet to the people of Rapa Nui, these inscriptions may have held sacred or practical significance. When missionaries and colonial officials dismissed the tablets, when native traditions were disrupted and populations decimated, what was lost was not merely a code, but a part of identity. That sense of rupture, of cultural voice interrupted, lingers with every attempt to read the signs. Even in failure, the act of study keeps alive the memory of the people who once gave life to those marks. Linear A offers a different kind of mystery. Its closeness to Linear B, which has been deciphered, makes the silence of Linear A even more haunting. We can see echoes of a system, a structure, an order in the characters, but the exact meaning remains elusive. The scholars who pore over the fragments from Crete know that each tablet once had a clear purpose. Perhaps it listed offerings to the gods, or perhaps it recorded exchanges of grain and olive oil. But now those purposes are veiled in ambiguity, transforming everyday notes into timeless enigmas. What might have been mundane to the Minoans has become extraordinary to us, precisely because it resists explanation. The Phaistos disc stands almost apart from the others, for it is not merely undeciphered but also unique. With only one example, comparisons and patterns are nearly impossible to establish. Its spiral of stamped symbols seems designed to tell a story or deliver a ritual chant, but without context, we cannot be certain. Some have speculated that it could even be a game, an experiment, or a decorative object rather than a true text. Whatever its purpose, its survival in isolation turns it into an eternal puzzle, one that invites endless interpretation without closure. Then there is the Indus script, scattered across thousands of seals and artifacts, a testament to a civilization that flourished for centuries. The brevity of the inscriptions suggests practical usage, yet the consistency of symbols points to an underlying system. Scholars debate whether it was a full writing system or a set of proto-symbols. The truth remains hidden, and in that uncertainty lies its allure. The Indus people spoke, traded, and lived, yet their voices remain locked behind signs that will not yield to us. The silence of their words becomes a kind of presence, reminding us that entire societies can exist beyond the reach of our understanding. These forgotten scripts are not failures of history, but rather invitations to reflect on the fragility of human expression. They remind us that language, like life, is temporary, dependent upon continuity, teaching, and preservation. When these break, the meaning dissolves, leaving behind only forms. And yet those forms still speak, not with the clarity of translation, but with the resonance of wonder. They speak of civilizations that valued memory enough to attempt permanence, and of the enduring human desire to leave a mark upon the world. In the quiet hours, when the mind drifts between thought and dream, these undeciphered symbols can feel almost alive. They resemble whispers just beyond hearing, or dreams just beyond remembering. To encounter them is to stand in the twilight between knowledge and imagination, where history becomes less about certainty and more about reverence. And perhaps that is the lesson they offer, that not everything must be explained in order to be meaningful. Sometimes, the very act of not knowing allows us to rest, to slow down, and to feel the weight of the past not as a burden, but as a gentle reminder of mystery. When we look closer at forgotten scripts, another aspect becomes striking. Their very survival is an accident of time. A fire that destroyed a library may have wiped away hundreds of scrolls in an instant, but a clay tablet, buried under layers of earth, might endure for thousands of years. This randomness makes every surviving fragment precious, because it represents not just a message, but also a victory over decay. The fact that we hold these undeciphered pieces in our hands today means that they have already crossed oceans of time, through disasters, neglect, and indifference, to arrive before us. Their endurance reminds us that human expression, though fragile, is also surprisingly resilient. One such example lies in the inscriptions of the Indus Valley civilization. Thousands of small seals, often made of steatite, bear markings that appear intentional, systematic, and carefully crafted. The symbols range from simple strokes and curves to more elaborate motifs, including human-like figures and animals. Many seals also include depictions of bulls, elephants, and mythical creatures. Scholars have long debated whether these images carried purely symbolic meaning or if they worked in tandem with the written marks to create a richer language of communication. Were these seals used by merchants to identify goods, or did they carry religious or political messages? No definitive answer exists, but every hypothesis adds another layer to our appreciation of the mystery. To walk among the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa and imagine the sounds of people trading, crafting, and recording their activities with symbols now forever silent is to feel the distance of millennia pressed into a single moment. The silence of their script is not empty. It is heavy with the weight of lost lives and forgotten rhythms of daily existence. Another layer of fascination arises from the possibility that some of these forgotten scripts may represent entire families of languages we have never encountered elsewhere. It is easy to imagine the dominant languages of history shaping the world: Latin, Greek, Arabic, Sanskrit, or Chinese. But what of those that left no descendants, whose last speakers never taught their words to a future generation? Their scripts are tombstones to languages that once carried laughter, commands, prayers, and stories. This sense of finality deepens the poignancy of studying them. Scholars sometimes describe the challenge as listening to echoes in a canyon. You hear shapes of sound, hints of rhythm, but the original voice remains forever out of reach. Yet even these echoes have meaning. They remind us of the vast diversity of human thought, of the countless ways people have sought to shape the world with marks and signs. Attempts at decipherment often reveal more about us than about the scripts themselves. For instance, throughout the 20th century, researchers tried to connect the Indus symbols with Sanskrit, with Dravidian languages, with Sumerian, or even with completely new proposed families. Each attempt reflected the intellectual assumptions and cultural leanings of its time. Sometimes these efforts have been criticized as imaginative leaps, more speculation than science. Yet they demonstrate the restless desire within us to connect, to bridge the gulf of time with knowledge, even if imperfect. The story of forgotten scripts is also the story of persistence. Generations of scholars pass on notes, sketches, and half-formed theories. New technologies emerge, allowing researchers to analyze tablets with high-resolution scans, to test chemical traces, or to build vast databases of signs in the hope that patterns will emerge. Progress is slow, uncertain, and often inconclusive. Yet the effort continues, driven by the idea that even one breakthrough could suddenly illuminate centuries of darkness. Consider the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs. For centuries, they were unreadable, mysterious symbols that seemed magical and impenetrable. Only with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, bearing the same text in 3 scripts, did scholars gain the key. This success fuels the hope that one day, a similar discovery may unlock the secrets of Rongorongo, Linear A, or the Indus script. Until then, these writing systems remain suspended between silence and revelation. There is also a quieter lesson here. Perhaps not everything must be solved. These scripts remind us that history is not a complete puzzle, but a series of fragments. Some fragments connect, others remain apart. In their incompleteness lies their beauty. To accept that we may never know everything is to accept the humility of being human. We are temporary witnesses, looking at marks left by others who were also temporary. The continuity is not in the meaning, but in the attempt itself, the attempt to leave something that endures. And so, as we reflect upon forgotten scripts, we are invited not only to search for answers, but also to rest within the questions. They are part of the great stillness of history, a stillness that soothes as much as it puzzles, a stillness that gently carries us into the quiet, where imagination and sleep meet. Among the many enigmas of forgotten scripts, there is one that stands apart because of its distance, its isolation, and its haunting sense of unfinished history. The mysterious glyphs of Rongorongo from Easter Island. When missionaries first arrived in the 19th century, they noticed wooden tablets inscribed with strange figures, lines of symbols carved with care and repetition. These marks seemed purposeful, yet they belonged to no known alphabet, and no one could clearly explain what they meant. Some locals said they were sacred. Others claimed only certain chiefs or priests understood them, and within a generation much of the knowledge had vanished, leaving behind only mute tablets. The symbols of Rongorongo are unlike those of the great ancient civilizations. Instead of rigid geometric signs, they depict small, almost playful figures of men, birds, fish, plants, and abstract shapes. Each symbol is arranged in neat rows, written in a unique style called reverse boustrophodon, meaning the lines alternate direction like an ox plowing a field, but with each symbol also rotated so that the reader would turn the tablet as they moved. To imagine such a script is to step into a completely different rhythm of writing and reading. It suggests a culture that did not simply adopt an external system, but crafted its own distinct way of preserving meaning. Yet what did these symbols say? Were they genealogies, religious chants, inventories of resources, or myths about gods and creation? No one can be certain. The tragedy of Rongorongo is that it came to the attention of scholars too late. By the time European collectors brought tablets to museums, the cultural continuity of reading them had already been broken. Colonization, disease, and forced changes to local life destroyed much of the oral tradition that might have kept the key alive. Today, only about 24 genuine tablets survive, scattered across institutions in Europe and the Americas. Researchers have photographed and cataloged every sign, noting repetitions, sequences, and structural patterns. Some symbols appear frequently, others rarely, hinting at possible grammar or formulaic usage. There are passages that resemble lists, and there are recurring motifs that suggest ritual or poetic structure. But without a bilingual text, as in the case of the Rosetta Stone, the door to full comprehension remains closed. Efforts at decipherment continue, but they are shadowed by the melancholy of absence. Some claim that Rongorongo may not have been a true script at all, but rather a system of proto-writing, meant to aid memory rather than record speech word for word. If this is true, then the dream of translating it into complete sentences may be misguided. Yet even if Rongorongo was not a full writing system, it still represents a monumental achievement of human creativity, a symbolic universe carved into wood to carry knowledge and meaning across time. The fate of Rongorongo reveals the vulnerability of scripts in the face of history. A written system depends not only on symbols, but on communities that use, teach, and value it. When those communities are disrupted or erased, the script dies, leaving behind fossils of thought. But in their silence, these fossils still speak to us about the resilience of culture. They show that even on one of the most remote islands in the Pacific, human beings felt the same impulse to mark, to record, to shape experience into signs that might endure. Beyond Easter Island, other scripts echo the same theme. The Phaistos disc, discovered on Crete, carries a spiral of stamped symbols that no one has decoded. The Voynich manuscript, filled with indecipherable text and curious drawings, continues to baffle both scholars and cryptographers. These works may never yield their secrets, yet their very mystery sustains fascination. They invite us to wonder not just about their content, but about the human urge to create such enigmatic records. Why did people go to such lengths to inscribe what could not easily be shared, or what was intended only for a select few? Perhaps the act of writing itself held a sacred power, independent of whether others could read it. To carve, to paint, to inscribe was to declare presence, to affirm existence in a universe that forgets so quickly. The forgotten scripts of history, whether they come from vast empires or isolated islands, remind us that meaning is fragile, bound to the continuity of human memory. Without teachers, a language disappears. Without readers, a script falls silent. And yet, paradoxically, their silence becomes another form of communication. It tells us that the past is not entirely ours to possess. Some parts of it remain untouchable, like sealed rooms in a vast house. In this way, forgotten scripts become guardians of mystery, not failures of memory, but reminders of its limits. They let us sleep in the comfort of knowing that not everything must be explained. Some things may remain as quiet companions, carrying their secrets through time, while we drift into our own dreams, guided not by certainty, but by wonder. As we move further into the world of forgotten scripts, we come across another mystery that seems almost deliberately designed to resist our attempts at understanding. This is the case of the Indus Valley script, sometimes referred to as the Harappan script, belonging to one of the oldest civilizations of South Asia. More than 4,000 years ago, the people of the Indus Valley built cities with astonishing sophistication, featuring carefully planned streets, advanced drainage systems, and an economy that thrived on trade. Yet the signs they carved on seals, pottery, and tablets remain mute to us today. These symbols are small, often inscribed in neat rows or clusters, sometimes accompanied by images of animals such as bulls, elephants, and mythical creatures. They were pressed into clay seals or etched onto small pieces of stone that merchants may have carried, perhaps as tokens of ownership, records of goods, or emblems of identity. Scholars have collected thousands of such examples, enough to establish that the system was consistent, but not enough to unlock its secrets. What makes the Indus script so elusive is that each inscription is incredibly short. Most examples contain only a handful of symbols, rarely more than a dozen. There are no long texts, no lengthy passages that might reveal grammar or narrative. Instead, we see fragments, as though someone had torn a book into tiny shreds and scattered them across the ruins. Without longer samples, it is nearly impossible to determine whether the symbols represent sounds, words, or abstract ideas. Some researchers believe it was a full writing system, recording a spoken language that has since disappeared. Others argue that it may have been a proto-writing system, meant to convey meaning without directly encoding speech. The debate has lasted for more than a century, and each new theory raises more questions than it answers. One of the most haunting aspects of the Indus script is that it belongs to a civilization that still feels half-hidden. Unlike ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley culture left behind no royal inscriptions, no grand declarations carved into stone. Its people were practical, focused on daily life, and their legacy lies in the bricks of their cities, the weights and measures of their trade, and the undeciphered symbols on their seals. When their civilization declined around 1900 BCE, perhaps due to climate shifts or changes in trade, the knowledge of their writing disappeared with them, leaving later generations unable to carry forward the tradition. The mystery of the Indus script is not just about language, but about memory. How can a society so advanced, with cities that rivaled the greatest of their time, leave behind a written system that no one else can read? What does it mean for our understanding of human history when one of the earliest urban civilizations remains silent in its own words? Attempts at decipherment have often relied on comparison. Some scholars have suggested links to early Dravidian languages, others to Sanskritic traditions, but without direct evidence, these remain guesses. Computer models have been used to analyze the sequences of symbols, showing patterns that resemble true writing systems, with rules and order. Yet without a bilingual text to guide us, the Indus script hovers in the twilight between possibility and silence. Perhaps what makes this case especially poignant is that the script was not intended for mystery. The people who carved these signs did so for practical reasons, for trade, for ritual, for communication. They did not expect that millennia later, strangers from across the world would stare at their marks without comprehension. And yet here we are, looking at their work as though peering through glass, able to see but not to touch, aware that meaning lies just beyond reach. The Indus script reminds us that history is not always linear, that knowledge can vanish as easily as it appears. A great civilization may rise, flourish, and fade, leaving behind not clarity but questions. And in those questions lies both frustration and fascination. For those who study the past, there is hope that one day a breakthrough will come, that some hidden text will emerge, or that new techniques will allow us to reconstruct meaning from fragments. But there is also a quiet recognition that some mysteries may never be solved, that some voices may remain whispers in the dust. In that silence, there is a strange peace. The forgotten scripts of the world, from Rongorongo to the Indus Valley, remind us that not all knowledge is ours to claim. Some belongs to time itself, carried forward not as instructions or records, but as symbols of the fragility of memory. They tell us that forgetting is as much a part of human history as remembering, and that the unknown can be as meaningful as the known. As we drift into the thought of these ancient marks, we realize that they are not just puzzles, but invitations to humility, a reminder that the past is vast, and we are only passing visitors, listening to echoes that may never form words. Among the many forgotten scripts scattered across human history, there is one that carries with it an almost mythical aura, the mysterious Rongorongo of Easter Island. Unlike the Indus script, which is linked to an expansive civilization, Rongorongo comes from a small and isolated island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui. This island, famous for its giant stone statues called moai, holds within it another mystery, carved not into stone faces, but into wooden tablets. These wooden tablets, now scattered in museums around the world, are inscribed with rows of small glyphs arranged in a curious pattern. The writing is read in a system known as reverse boustrophedon, meaning that the lines alternate direction, with each line read in the opposite way to the one before it, and the characters often appear upside down depending on the row. The glyphs themselves are beautiful and haunting, resembling stylized figures of humans, animals, plants, and abstract shapes. They seem to tell stories or record knowledge, yet they remain stubbornly silent because no one alive today knows how to read them. The history of Rongorongo is clouded by loss. By the time Europeans arrived on the island in the 18th century, the local culture had already endured dramatic changes, including societal collapse, conflict, and the devastation brought by disease and enslavement. Missionaries and colonizers discouraged or outright suppressed local traditions, and the knowledge of reading Rongorongo disappeared within just a few generations. The surviving tablets, perhaps 24 in total, are precious remnants of a once living script. Some may have been burned or destroyed by those who did not see value in them, while others were taken overseas, often without proper records of their origin. As a result, Not only do we lack the knowledge of how to read the script, but we also lack the cultural context that might have guided its use. Scholars who have studied Rongorongo face enormous challenges. The texts are relatively short, much like the Indus script, offering little material to establish a system. No bilingual texts exist, no Rosetta Stone equivalent that might allow comparison to a known language. Some researchers believe Rongorongo was influenced by early European contact, perhaps inspired by written forms introduced by outsiders, while others insist it was a true indigenous script, independently created by the people of Rapa Nui. Linguists and anthropologists have poured decades into studying the glyphs, cataloging patterns, and noting repetitions. Some sequences suggest they might represent calendrical data, marking cycles of the moon or the seasons. Others suggest genealogical records, chants, or myths passed down in symbolic form. The figures of birds and fish appear often, possibly reflecting the island's deep reliance on the sea and its rich mythology surrounding birdmen and ancestral spirits. Yet without the voices of those who once held this knowledge, the tablets remain enigmatic, like windows to a world we cannot fully enter. What makes the case of Rongorongo especially poignant is that the last keepers of its meaning may have lived not so long ago. Some island elders in the 19th century were said to have remembered fragments of its use, but by the time researchers began collecting the tablets, that fragile link had already been severed. The silence of Rongorongo is not ancient silence, but recent, born of disruption and cultural erosion. It serves as a painful reminder of how easily knowledge can vanish when traditions are broken and how colonization often accelerated that loss. Today, the tablets are preserved behind glass, admired for their beauty, yet they stand as symbols of a language whose voice has been cut short. For the people of Rapa Nui, they represent not only mystery, but heritage, a piece of identity tied to ancestors whose wisdom remains hidden. For the wider world, they serve as one of the few known cases of an independent invention of writing, a rare human attempt to capture thought in symbol. The forgotten scripts of the world, whether from great civilizations or small islands, share this common truth, that writing is both a tool and a fragile thread. Without continuity, without teaching and passing on, the meanings dissolve, leaving behind only shapes that puzzle the eye. Rongorongo, like the Indus script, like Linear A of Crete, waits in silence. Whether it will ever be read is uncertain, but in its unreadability lies a strange comfort. It tells us that the past is not entirely ours to possess, that some parts of human history remain private to those who lived them. It reminds us of the fragility of culture, of how quickly it can fade, and of the responsibility we carry to preserve what we know today for the generations yet to come. As the waves crash endlessly against the cliffs of Easter Island, the wooden tablets remain still, as though listening, as though waiting, whispering across time that not every story needs to be solved to hold meaning. When we step back and look at the long history of human writing, it becomes clear that forgotten scripts are not simply puzzles waiting for code breakers, but echoes of entire worlds that once existed. Every unreadable sign carved into stone or etched onto clay was once alive with meaning, once part of a voice that flowed naturally among people who understood it as easily as we read letters today. The forgotten scripts, from the enigmatic markings of the Indus Valley to the flowing shapes of Linear A, from the silent Rongorongo tablets to the undeciphered carvings of the Olmec civilization in Mesoamerica, form a gallery of mystery that humbles us. Each one reminds us of how fragile communication can be, and how much of our heritage can slip into silence if the thread of continuity is broken. The Olmec civilization, for example, flourished in what is now Mexico long before the rise of the Maya and the Aztec. They left behind colossal stone heads that have become icons of ancient art, but also inscriptions carved into monuments and portable objects that suggest some form of writing. Scholars debate whether these are a true script or proto-writing, symbols on the cusp of becoming language. Without a body of texts, without long passages that reveal structure, the debate may never be resolved. Yet even without reading them, the symbols whisper of an intelligence striving to record meaning, to preserve something worth remembering. It is this drive that unites all forgotten scripts, whether they appear in sprawling civilizations or on isolated islands. The human desire to write seems universal, as though across time and geography, people shared an impulse to give permanence to thought, to carry knowledge beyond the frailty of memory. And yet, writing is only as strong as its survival. Papyrus rots, wood burns, clay breaks, and stone erodes. Even when the symbols endure, the knowledge of how to read them can vanish in a single generation, swept away by conquest, plague, or forced assimilation. What remains is not language, but art, patterns stripped of their voice. In some cases, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, luck and perseverance bring rediscovery, as with the Rosetta Stone that offered scholars the key. In others, the silence lingers, century after century, defying attempts at understanding. The forgotten scripts remind us that we are not the only storytellers in history, nor the only thinkers to seek permanence. They also remind us of humility, that no matter how advanced our tools become, there will always be mysteries that resist solution. To hold a tablet of Rongorongo, or to gaze at an Indus seal, is to feel both closeness and distance. The object itself is real, tangible, held in the same hand that now holds a pen or types on a keyboard, but the meaning remains locked, as if behind glass. It is a strange duality to be surrounded by words that are words no longer, to see communication that does not communicate. Some find frustration in this, but there is a quiet beauty too. For those who cannot sleep, these forgotten scripts offer a calming reminder that not all questions need answers, not all mysteries need solutions. Some things can be left unknown, resting in their own silence, like the stillness of night. They are part of the background hum of history, steady and unchanging, like the rhythm of the sea or the drift of stars. To drift into sleep thinking of them is to accept that the world is vast, that knowledge is infinite, and that being surrounded by unknowns is part of being human. As the story of forgotten scripts comes to an end, it is not an ending of resolution, but of continuation. They remain out there, waiting, not lost, but unread. Perhaps someday a new discovery will bring clarity, perhaps not. But either way, their presence in museums and ruins and quiet storerooms continues to speak, if not in words, then in wonder. The forgotten scripts are more than puzzles, they are memorials. They carry the weight of voices long past, voices that once laughed, prayed, bartered, and sang. To think of them now is to hear an echo carried on the wind, soft and distant, calling us not to solve, but to remember. And in remembering, we honor them, giving back a fragment of what was taken by time. In this way, even unreadable, they fulfill their purpose, they endure. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with Sleep Whisper. May your morning, when you wake, be filled with good fortune, gentle energy, and success in everything you do. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow night, here at Sleep Whisper.